I sacrificed my entire life, my retirement, and my peace of mind to protect my wife from a federal prison sentence. I kept her darkest secret locked away for 5 years, paying for her crimes with the sweat off my own back. But when I finally reached my breaking point and handed her divorce papers, she did not apologize. She sneered right in my face and swore she would take my business, my home, and every last dime I had left. Then my son played the video I had hidden. He looked right at her and said, "Dad kept this secret for you." That was the exact moment my wife finally broke down and begged me to stay. But to understand why I walked away without a shred of pity, you need to hear exactly how this nightmare began. I am 68 years old. For over 40 years, I have run a commercial heating and air conditioning fleet right here in the suburbs of Chicago. My hands are permanently scarred from cutting sheet metal, hauling heavy compressor units onto icy rooftops, and turning wrenches until my joints ached. I built my company from a single rusted service van into a highly respected fleet of 30 trucks. I worked grueling 60-hour weeks, so my wife Patricia could live a life of absolute luxury. But on a rainy Tuesday morning, the heavy thud of a thick manila folder hitting our imported marble kitchen island was the most definitive sound I had ever made in my own house. Patricia was standing by the expensive espresso machine wearing a silk robe that I had paid for. She did not jump or act surprised when the divorce papers slid across the polished stone and stopped just inches from her manicured hand. She simply continued stirring her coffee. The silver spoon clinked against the ceramic rim in a slow, agonizing rhythm. Finally, she looked up at me. There was no shock in her eyes. There was only pure, unfiltered boredom. I stood across from her wearing my heavy canvas work jacket and steel-toed boots. I told her the marriage was over. I told her I had already signed the documents and that she needed to review the terms with her own counsel. Patricia took a slow sip of her coffee. She set the mug down and let out a short, mocking laugh. She asked me if I was having a senior moment. She said a blue-collar mechanic like me could never afford to divorce a woman like her, and she advised me to put the papers in the trash before I embarrassed myself. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout. I reached inside my heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a second stack of papers. These were not legal forms from my attorney. These were printed bank statements from our joint savings and investment accounts. I threw them down right on top of the divorce petition. I told Patricia to look at the highlighted transaction lines. I told her I knew exactly what she had been doing every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, while I was out freezing on commercial rooftops making payroll. I told her I knew all about Julian. The mention of his name made her posture go completely rigid. Julian was a slick, 35-year-old real estate developer who had recently moved into our affluent suburban circle. He drove a leased luxury car, wore custom-tailored suits, and smiled like a predator, looking for easy prey. He was exactly the kind of man I despised, a fast-talking opportunist who never worked a hard day in his life. I looked my wife dead in the eyes and explained that I had spent the entire weekend running a forensic trace on our joint accounts. I told her I saw the massive unauthorized wire transfers leaving my hard-earned savings and dropping directly into the operating account of Julian's fraudulent real estate firm. She had funneled over $80,000 of my money to her younger lover under the guise of fake consulting fees. Patricia stared at the highlighted bank statements. For a brief second, I thought I saw a flash of panic, a momentary realization that she had been caught red-handed. But the panic vanished instantly. The woman I had been married to for over 3 decades did not apologize. She did not break down in tears or try to invent an excuse. Her face transformed into a mask of pure vicious arrogance. She crossed her arms and told me the money was an investment. She claimed Julian was a visionary who was going to double those funds in a commercial property flip. She actually had the nerve to look down at my work boots and tell me that someone who works with their hands for a living could never understand high-level corporate finance. The sheer audacity of her statement made my chest burn with a righteous, blinding anger. I took a step closer to the marble island, planting my hands firmly on the stone surface. I told her she had no right to lecture me about finance or investments, not after what I had done for her, not after the massive crushing burden I had carried in total silence for 5 agonizing years. I forced her to look at me, demanding she acknowledge the reality she had worked so hard to ignore. 5 years ago, Patricia had served as the volunteer treasurer for our large community church. It was a position of profound trust. The congregation had raised $250,000 to build a new youth center and outreach clinic. But that money never made it to the construction fund. I discovered by total accident that Patricia had systematically embezzled $250,000 from the church. She had drained the community fund to pay off massive hidden gambling debts and to maintain a lavish country club lifestyle she felt she was entitled to. I had found the altered ledger books in her home office. I had even recovered the security footage from the church administration room showing her physically tampering with the deposit bags late at night. She had committed federal wire fraud and grand larceny. If the church board had discovered the missing funds, they would have called the police immediately. The federal authorities would have placed my wife in handcuffs, paraded her in front of the local news cameras, and locked her in a federal penitentiary for a decade. Her reputation in our affluent social circle would have been utterly annihilated, but I did not turn her in. I was a man who believed in the absolute sanctity of his marriage vows. I believed it was my fundamental duty as a husband to protect my family from destruction, even when the threat came from inside my own home. I confronted her privately. She cried, she begged, and she swore on her life that she would change if I just helped her fix the terrifying mess she had made. So I did exactly what a devoted, hard-working man does. I saved her. I did not just empty my personal savings account. I quietly took out a massive second mortgage on my commercial heating and air conditioning business. I jeopardized the financial security of my 30 employees. I took $250,000 of clean, hard-earned money and anonymously deposited it directly back into the church building fund to replace every single dime she had stolen. I buried her crime. I kept the recovered security footage hidden in a fireproof floor safe in my basement workspace, a digital insurance policy that I prayed I would never have to look at again. I carried the soul-crushing weight of that secret entirely alone. For 5 years, I worked myself into the ground to pay off that massive commercial loan. I skipped family vacations. I worked through major holidays. I took on dangerous freezing emergency repair jobs in the dead of winter just to make the punishing monthly interest payments. I sacrificed my physical health, my retirement timeline, and my peace of mind, all to ensure my wife could continue walking around our community with her head held high. I poured out my heart in that kitchen, reminding her of the immense sacrifice I had made to keep her out of a concrete prison cell. I told her that my hands were calloused and stained with grease because I had literally bought her freedom with my own blood and sweat. I expected her to feel a shred of remorse. I expected the memory of my sacrifice to finally crack her arrogant facade. I was a naive fool. Patricia did not lower her head. She did not show an ounce of gratitude. Instead, she let out a cold, chilling laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of our kitchen. She looked at me with an expression of absolute disgust. She told me I was pathetic. She said I paid that money back because I was too weak and too cowardly to endure the public scandal of having a criminal wife. She actually claimed I did it for my own ego, not for her. She told me I was a foolish, aging mechanic who enjoyed playing the martyr. She said she never asked to be saved, and she certainly did not owe me a lifetime of loyalty just because I chose to act like a desperate savior. Her words felt like a physical blow to the chest. The woman standing in front of me was not the partner I had built a life with. She was a remorseless parasite, The gratitude I had hoped for never existed. She had only viewed my sacrifice as a convenient weakness, a safety net that allowed her to become even more reckless and cruel. She stepped right up to the edge of the marble island, her eyes flashing with a predatory confidence. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest and delivered her final devastating threat. Patricia explicitly refused to sign the divorce papers. She told me that if I tried to leave her, she would not just walk away quietly. She promised to hire the most ruthless, aggressive family law attorney in the state of Illinois. She swore she would drag my name through the mud, accuse me of severe financial abuse, and claim my mind was failing. She looked at my heavy work boots and smiled a venomous smile. She told me she was going to take full ownership of my commercial fleet. She was going to take the suburban house I paid for. She promised to legally extract every single dollar of alimony the court would allow, leaving me to die penniless in a cheap rented room, while she and Julian spent my money traveling the world. I stood in my own kitchen, listening to the woman I had saved from federal prison outline her meticulous plan to completely destroy my life. She expected me to back down. She expected the threat of a brutal court battle to terrify an older blue-collar man into quiet submission. She expected me to pick up those divorce papers, throw them in the trash, and go back to work so she could continue funding her illicit life. I did not back down. I did not raise my voice or try to argue with a monster. I simply looked her in the eyes, turned around, and walked out the front door. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me, severing the final thread of our marriage. I walked out to my work truck, feeling the cold morning air against my face. I knew the battle lines were drawn. Patricia thought she held all the cards. She thought her manipulative tactics and aggressive threats would secure her victory. But she had made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. She had forgotten exactly who she was dealing with. She had forgotten that a man who spends 40 years dismantling and rebuilding massive, complex commercial machinery knows exactly how to tear a defective system apart, piece by piece. I got into the driver's seat and started the heavy diesel engine. I was not going to let a deceitful, ungrateful criminal take my life's work. I was not going to let her steal my son's inheritance to fund her arrogant lover. The time for silent sacrifice was over. It was time to strike back, and I knew exactly where I was going to begin. The cold Chicago air bit at my face the morning after I walked out of my own home. I had slept for 3 hours in the cab of my heavy-duty Ford work truck, parked in the empty lot of my commercial heating and air conditioning warehouse. My bones ached from the cramped space and the bitter dampness that seeped through the windshield, but I did not have time to sit and feel sorry for myself. I am a man who has worked his entire life with his hands. I built a massive logistics and HVAC fleet from nothing but sweat copper wire and sheer willpower. I knew that mourning a dead marriage would not pay the wages of the 30 loyal men who depended on me to feed their families. I had commercial rooftop units to install Freon to secure and a business to run. I washed my face with freezing water from the warehouse bathroom sink, put on my canvas jacket, and drove straight to the industrial supply depot on the south side of the city. The supply house was a massive, echoing warehouse filled with the sharp smell of cut steel and machine oil. It was a place I had visited every single Wednesday morning for the last 30 years. I walked up to the main commercial counter and handed the clerk my weekly purchase order. I needed 4 industrial compressor units, 10 cylinders of commercial refrigerant, and a pallet of heavy-gauge copper tubing. The total invoice came to roughly $14,000. It was a standard weekly expense for a fleet of my size. I pulled my corporate platinum card from my wallet and handed it to the clerk with a tired but polite smile. He swiped the card through the terminal. The machine beeped a sharp negative tone. The clerk frowned, wiped the magnetic strip on his shirt, and swiped it again. The machine beeped again. The clerk looked up at me with an apologetic expression and told me the card had been declined. I felt a sudden hot flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. I am a man who prides himself on absolute financial reliability. In 40 years of business, I had never bounced a check or missed a vendor payment. I assumed it was a simple banking error, a security flag triggered by a large early morning purchase. I apologized for the delay, pulled out my personal debit card, and told the clerk to run the transaction through my private checking account. I knew for an absolute fact that my personal account held over $90,000 in liquid cash. The clerk swiped my personal card. The terminal instantly flashed a bright red warning code. Declined. Insufficient funds. The humiliation was absolute and suffocating. Several other contractors were standing in line behind me, shifting impatiently in their work boots. I could feel their eyes burning into my back. A man who owned 30 commercial service trucks suddenly could not afford to buy basic materials. I quietly asked the clerk to hold the pallet of equipment in the back and promised I would return as soon as I sorted out the banking error. I walked out of the supply house with my head down, feeling a strange, creeping sense of dread settling deep into my stomach. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, turned on the heavy diesel engine, and immediately dialed the direct extension of my commercial bank manager. I bypassed the standard customer service lines entirely. When the manager answered, his voice did not have the usual warm, respectful tone I was accustomed to. He sounded tense, bureaucratic, and deeply uncomfortable. I demanded to know why a corporate account with massive cash reserves was suddenly rejecting a standard vendor transaction. The bank manager took a slow, heavy breath and delivered the fatal blow. He told me that my accounts were not suffering from a technical error. He informed me that at exactly 8 o'clock the previous night, less than an hour after I had confronted my wife in our kitchen, the bank had received a binding judicial order. Patricia had not just hired a vicious divorce attorney. She had unleashed a meticulously planned financial ambush. Using a predatory legal loophole, her high-priced lawyer had contacted a family court night judge and filed an emergency ex parte motion. An ex parte motion is a ruthless legal maneuver that allows one party to present a case to a judge without the other party even being present in the room to defend themselves. It is a tactic strictly reserved for situations involving imminent physical danger or severe financial flight risks. Patricia had walked into that midnight courtroom and signed a sworn affidavit claiming that I was suffering from a violent paranoid breakdown. She lied under oath, telling the judge that I had financially abandoned her, that I was secretly draining our marital assets, and that I was planning to flee the jurisdiction and leave her completely destitute. She used the fact that I had simply walked out of my own front door to de-escalate an argument as physical proof of my abandonment. She played the role of a terrified, helpless victim so perfectly that the judge granted her emergency request without hesitation. The bank manager coldly explained that the federal authorities had executed a hard freeze on absolutely everything bearing my name. They locked my commercial operating accounts. They locked my personal savings. They even froze the emergency credit lines I kept open for fleet repairs. The financial execution was instantaneous and absolute. I sat in the freezing cab of my truck, clutching the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Patricia had systematically cut off my entire oxygen supply. Her strategy was brilliantly cruel. By freezing my assets completely, she ensured that I could not hire a high-powered forensic accounting team to unravel the $250,000 she had embezzled from the church. She knew I could not afford to hire a defense attorney to fight her in family court. But the most devastating part of her attack was directed right at the heart of my business. Today was Wednesday. In exactly 48 hours, the weekly payroll for my 30 mechanics and drivers was scheduled to hit the banking network. If those automated checks bounced on Friday morning, my men would refuse to drive. My entire logistics and repair fleet would grind to a sudden catastrophic halt. If the trucks stopped rolling, my commercial clients would instantly file breach of contract lawsuits against me. The business I had spent 40 years building from nothing would collapse into legal receivership by Monday morning. Patricia would then be perfectly positioned to pick the bones clean in the divorce settlement, taking full ownership of my ruined empire, just as she had promised. I felt a wave of dizzying panic wash over me. I needed to form a strategy. I needed to call my suppliers and beg for lines of credit. I needed to figure out how to keep my men paid and my trucks on the road. But before I could even shift my truck into gear, my cell phone vibrated violently against the center console. I looked at the caller identification screen. It was Lucas, my 35-year-old son. Lucas is a brilliant, hard-working man. He runs a small but successful information technology consulting firm in the city. He has a wife and a young daughter, and he has always been the pride of my life. I answered the phone, trying to force a calm, reassuring tone into my voice so he would not hear the absolute desperation I was currently drowning in. But Lucas was not calling to check on me. He was in a state of absolute blind panic. His voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand his words. He told me he had just tried to log into his business payroll portal to pay his software engineers, and his access was completely denied. He called his bank only to be told that his corporate operating accounts, his personal checking accounts, and the college savings fund he had started for his infant daughter were all permanently locked by a county court order. My heart completely stopped. The air in the cabin of my truck suddenly felt too thick to breathe. I asked Lucas to read me the exact legal code the bank had provided him. When he recited the docket numbers, the dark, horrifying reality of my wife's betrayal fully materialized in my mind. Patricia had not just targeted me. She had deliberately and maliciously targeted her own flesh and blood. In her emergency ex parte motion, Patricia and her ruthless attorney had intentionally listed Lucas as a criminal co-conspirator. She had sworn under penalty of perjury that I was using my son's information technology firm as a shadow entity to illegally hide our joint marital assets. She claimed that I was actively funneling millions of dollars in commercial heating and air conditioning profits directly into his corporate accounts to shield the money from the divorce settlement. It was a complete fabricated lie, a monstrous work of fiction designed to trigger a blanket financial freeze on everything Lucas owned. The judge, acting entirely on Patricia's fabricated evidence, had ordered the immediate seizure of my son's entire financial existence. I listened to Lucas hyperventilating on the other end of the phone. He was terrified. He was a young father with a mortgage, a business to run, and employees who depended on him. He had absolutely no idea why the state court system had suddenly decided to annihilate his life. He was begging me to tell him what was happening, asking if our commercial bank had been hacked, or if there was some massive identity theft crisis. I closed my eyes and let my head fall back against the leather headrest. The sheer magnitude of Patricia's cruelty was almost impossible to process. She was not just defending herself against a divorce. She was operating like a ruthless predator, willing to absolutely destroy anyone who stood between her and the money she felt she was entitled to. She knew that Lucas loved me. She knew that if I was bankrupted, Lucas would not hesitate to drain his own savings to help me hire a competent legal defense team. To prevent me from getting any outside help, she decided to financially suffocate her own son. She was willing to bankrupt his small business, destroy his professional reputation, and freeze the college money of her own innocent granddaughter just to ensure that I remained completely isolated and entirely defenseless. I spoke quietly into the phone. I told Lucas the truth. I explained that his mother had found out I was filing for divorce because I had discovered she was embezzling money and funneling it to another man. I explained the emergency court order and the fabricated conspiracy charges she had filed against him. The line went completely dead for a long time. I could hear Lucas breathing heavily, trying to absorb the fact that his own mother had just deliberately pushed him to the edge of total financial ruin. When he finally spoke, His voice was no longer shaking with panic. It was completely hollow, stripped of all the love and respect he had ever held for the woman who raised him. He asked me what we were going to do. I sat there in the freezing morning light, looking out at the cracked asphalt of the industrial parking lot. A profound, fundamental shift occurred deep inside my chest. The sorrow and the heartbreak I had felt the night before completely evaporated. The agonizing grief over losing my marriage of 35 years was instantly burned away by a white-hot, absolute clarity. You can attack me. You can steal my savings. You can try to take my business, and you can drag my name through the mud in a courtroom. I am an old man, and I have weathered terrible storms before. But the moment you deliberately target my child, the moment you decide to bankrupt my son, and threaten the future of my innocent grandchild just to protect your own selfish greed, you have crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. Patricia thought she was dealing with a tired, broken mechanic who would quietly surrender under the crushing weight of a financial freeze. She thought I would beg her to drop the court orders. She thought I would crawl back to that massive suburban house and accept her terms just to save my son from ruin. She fundamentally misunderstood the man she had been married to for over 3 decades. I am a man who builds things from concrete and steel. I understand how systems work, and I know exactly how to dismantle them. I told Lucas to stay exactly where he was, and not to contact his mother or her attorney under any circumstances. I told him I was coming to his office, and that we were going to fix this together. I ended the call, and placed my phone on the dashboard. I was no longer fighting a simple divorce battle over a house and an alimony check. I was fighting a war on 2 fronts. I had 48 hours to bypass the frozen banking network, secure the payroll for my 30 employees, and keep my commercial fleet on the road. And I had to find a way to completely destroy the fabricated legal narrative Patricia had constructed before the courts permanently liquidated my son's future. I put my heavy work truck into gear and drove out of the supply house parking lot. The time for silent sacrifice was over. Patricia had unleashed the full blind power of the state court system to suffocate me, but she did not realize that I had spent the last 5 years quietly hiding the exact digital evidence required to turn the justice system into my own personal execution squad. I walked down the wooden stairs into the basement of our home. The steps creaked under my heavy steel-toed boots. This basement was my sanctuary. It was a sprawling workshop with a poured concrete floor that smelled faintly of machine oil, ozone, and old sawdust. The walls were lined with heavy pegboards holding wrenches, pipe cutters, and gauges I had accumulated over 40 years of breaking my back in the commercial heating and air conditioning trade. Every tool had a purpose. Every scratch on the metal told a story of a long night spent on a freezing commercial roof. But today, I was not here to fix a broken compressor. I was here to dismantle the biggest lie of my life. I walked past the heavy wooden workbench and moved to the far corner of the room. There was a thick rubber mat covering a section of the concrete floor. I bent down, my old knees popping in protest, and pulled the heavy mat aside. Beneath it was a solid steel fireproof floor safe, set flush into the foundation. I had installed it myself decades ago to protect our most important documents. I knelt on the cold concrete and rested my calloused fingers on the cold metal dial. I took a slow, deep breath. I spun the dial with practiced precision. Right to 34, left past 0 to 17, right to 52. The heavy brass tumblers clicked into place with a solid, satisfying sound. I pulled the heavy steel handle, and the thick door swung open on its greased hinges. The safe was dark and smelled like stale air and old paper. Inside, sitting on top of our marriage certificate and the original deed to our home, was a small black flash drive. I reached in and picked it up. It was just a tiny piece of plastic weighing less than an ounce, but resting in the palm of my rough hand, it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. This small device held the darkest chapter of our family history. It held the raw, undeniable proof of the crime Patricia had committed 5 years ago. I pulled out an old metal folding chair and sat down at my workbench. I stared at the flash drive and let the silence of the basement wash over me. The memories came flooding back thick and suffocating. I thought about the woman I had married 36 years ago. When we first met, Patricia was kind, radiant, and full of life. We had absolutely nothing back then. We lived in a cramped, drafty apartment, and I worked 18-hour days just to put food on the table. She used to pack my lunch, kiss my cheek, and tell me that as long as we were together, we were richer than anyone else in the world. I loved her with a fierce, uncompromising devotion. When our son Lucas was born, I swore to God that I would build an empire with my bare hands, so they would never have to know the sting of poverty. And I did. I built a massive commercial fleet. We moved into a beautiful home. We became respected members of the community. Patricia became a pillar of our local church, eventually taking over as the volunteer treasurer. I was so incredibly proud of her. I thought we had achieved the American dream. But that dream shattered 5 years ago. I remembered the exact sickening feeling that washed over me when I accidentally found the altered church ledgers in her home office. The congregation had raised $250,000 to build a new youth outreach center. The money was simply gone. Patricia had systematically drained the accounts. When I confronted her, she broke down. She fell to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, begging for my forgiveness. She told me she had developed a secret gambling addiction. She claimed the lavish country club lifestyle she had grown accustomed to had pressured her into making terrible financial decisions. She swore she was terrified that she was drowning in debt and that she only took the money because she was desperate. Seeing the woman I loved weeping on the floor, terrified of going to federal prison, completely broke my heart. I did not judge her. I did not abandon her. I made an agonizing decision to protect my family at all costs. I secretly took out a massive second mortgage on my commercial heating and air conditioning business. I put my 30 employees and my entire life's work at catastrophic risk. I took $250,000 of clean, honest money and anonymously replaced every single dime she had stolen from the church. I saved her from a federal indictment. I saved her reputation. For the next 5 years, I paid a terrible physical and mental price for that decision. I worked through blinding pain, freezing winters, and blistering summers to pay off that massive corporate loan. I missed holidays. I skipped vacations. I mortgaged my own retirement to keep her safe. I kept this flash drive, which contained the security footage of her stealing the deposit bags, securely locked in my floor safe. It was an insurance policy, a dark secret I planned to take to my grave. But today, sitting in the dusty light of my basement, the memory of her tears felt like a toxic poison. She had not been grateful. She had grown arrogant, cruel, and distant. And now she was trying to financially suffocate our own son just to steal my company and run away with a younger man. I opened my heavy-duty work laptop, flipped up the screen, and plugged the black flash drive into the side port. The computer chimed softly. A window popped up on the screen displaying the main video file I had saved 5 years ago. I clicked on it. The screen illuminated with the grainy black and white security footage of the church administration room. There was Patricia sneaking in late at night, nervously looking over her shoulder as she stuffed thick bank deposit bags into her designer purse. Watching it again made my chest ache with a fresh, sharp pain. I closed the video player. I was about to eject the drive and take it straight to my lawyer, but something caught my eye. When you manage a fleet of 30 commercial HVAC trucks, you do not just turn wrenches. You deal with highly complex commercial routing software, encrypted dispatch networks, and digital logistics databases. I had spent years learning how to navigate hidden file directories and bypass system errors to keep my dispatch network running smoothly. Because of that experience, my eyes naturally scanned the storage capacity bar at the bottom of the screen. The flash drive had a storage capacity of 64 gigabytes. The single security video of Patricia stealing the money was only 2 gigabytes in size. Yet the system properties showed that the drive was almost entirely full. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor. My pulse quickened. There was a massive block of data on this drive that was not visible in the main directory. Someone had created a hidden partition. When I originally backed up the church security footage 5 years ago, I had used a flash drive I found in Patricia's home office desk. In my desperate rush to secure the video and save her, I had simply dropped the video file onto the drive without formatting it. I had completely missed the fact that the drive already contained a massive concealed volume of data. I cracked my knuckles and went to work. I opened a command terminal on my laptop. The screen turned black with a blinking green cursor. I typed in a string of administrative commands bypassing the standard user interface to force the computer to read the raw data sectors of the flash drive. A few seconds later, a secondary folder materialized on my screen. It was locked behind a heavy digital encryption wall. Patricia was not a technical genius, so I knew the password would not be incredibly complex. I tried her birth date. Access denied. I tried our anniversary. Access denied. I thought about her absolute arrogance, her obsession with her own status. I typed in the name of the private country club she loved more than anything else, followed by the year she joined. The command terminal flashed green. Access granted. The encrypted folder burst open, spilling hundreds of files across my screen. They were not photos or bank statements. They were exported archives of text messages and private emails. I clicked on the first email thread. The sender's name hit me with the force of a sledgehammer. It was Julian. Julian was the slick 35-year-old real estate developer I had just caught Patricia funneling money to from our joint accounts. I had assumed their affair was a recent betrayal, a sickening midlife crisis that had started over the last few months. But as I looked at the timestamp on the very first email in the archive, the air completely left my lungs. The email was dated exactly 5 years ago. It was sent 2 months before Patricia embezzled the money from the church. My hands actually trembled as I scrolled through the messages. I was reading a masterclass in manipulation and pure, unadulterated greed. Julian was not just some new lover she had met at a country club mixer. Julian was the architect of the entire nightmare. I read a message from Julian explaining to Patricia that he desperately needed $250,000 in untraceable seed capital to secure his very first commercial property flip. He told her that traditional banks had rejected his loan applications because of his poor credit history. He wrote that if he could just get his hands on that initial cash, he could build a massive real estate firm, and they could finally be together in absolute luxury. I scrolled down to Patricia's response. I expected to see hesitation. I expected to read the words of a woman struggling with her conscience. Instead, I read the cold, calculated words of a willing predator. Patricia wrote back and told him exactly how much cash the church was currently holding for the new youth center. She explained the vulnerabilities in the church accounting system. She detailed exactly how she could manipulate the ledgers to slowly bleed the account dry without triggering an immediate audit. Julian replied with step-by-step instructions on how to structure the deposits into a secondary account so the funds could be quietly transferred to his real estate firm. He coached her on exactly what to say if anyone got suspicious. He even told her to manufacture a story about a secret gambling addiction if she ever got caught, because a gambling addiction would generate sympathy and make her look like a helpless victim rather than a calculating thief. I sat in the cold, dimly lit basement staring at the glowing screen as the absolute totality of the betrayal washed over me. Patricia did not have a gambling problem. She never had a gambling problem. She had not made a tragic mistake under the pressure of keeping up appearances. The tears she had cried on the floor of our home 5 years ago were a flawless rehearsed performance. She had stolen the community outreach funds explicitly to finance Julian's business venture. For 5 years I had worked in freezing rain and brutal heat, destroying my own body to pay back a debt that she had intentionally created to fund her lover's real estate empire. I had mortgaged my company, risked the livelihoods of my 30 employees, and surrendered my peace of mind to save a woman who was actively laughing at me behind my back. Julian had built his slick, arrogant persona using the money I had bled to replace. The custom-tailored suits he wore, the luxury car he drove, and the commercial properties he flipped were all built on a foundation of my stolen sweat and my misplaced loyalty. And now, 5 years later, they were executing the final phase of their plan. Julian's business was fully established, and Patricia was ready to leave. But they were not content with just walking away. They wanted to strip me to the bone. They wanted my commercial fleet, my home, and every last dollar of alimony they could extract. They wanted to financially suffocate my son Lucas just to ensure I could not fight back. They viewed me as a disposable machine, a silent engine they had used to generate wealth until it was time to scrap me for parts. A terrifying, absolute silence fell over the basement workshop. The shock and the heartbreak I had felt upstairs were entirely gone. There was no more sadness left in my body. There was only a cold, methodical, and profoundly dangerous clarity. I reached out and carefully copied the entire decrypted folder onto my secure laptop hard drive. I backed it up to a secondary server I used for my commercial dispatch records. I safely ejected the flash drive and slipped it into the breast pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. I looked around the dusty workshop. I looked at the heavy steel tools hanging on the pegboards, the tools I had used to build a life of honor and integrity. Patricia and Julian thought they had outsmarted a simple blue-collar mechanic. They thought their digital encryption and their emergency court orders made them untouchable. They thought they had buried me under an avalanche of legal paperwork, but they had handed me the exact weapon I needed to tear their entire world straight down to the bedrock. They had given me undeniable, documented proof of a massive, premeditated federal conspiracy. I stood up from the workbench and turned off the basement light. I walked up the wooden stairs with a heavy, deliberate stride. I was going to call Patricia's brother. I was going to rally my son. And I was going to dismantle my wife and her arrogant lover with the exact same merciless precision they had used against me. I walked out of my basement workshop and up the wooden stairs with a heavy but steady stride. The sheer magnitude of my wife's betrayal had completely burned away any lingering sadness in my heart. I was no longer a grieving husband trying to salvage a broken marriage. I was a commercial foreman who had just discovered that the foundation of his entire life was rigged with explosives. I knew from 40 years of running a commercial heating and air conditioning fleet that you cannot fight a massive structural fire alone. You need a crew you can trust with your life. You need someone on the inside who knows the terrain. I reached into the pocket of my heavy canvas jacket and pulled out my phone. I needed to call Greg. Greg was Patricia's younger brother. He was 55 years old, a straight-shooting, hard-working residential framing contractor. We had always gotten along perfectly. Over the past 3 decades, we had drank cold beers on my back porch, built wooden decks together, and talked about the struggles of running blue-collar businesses in the Chicago suburbs. Greg was a man with rough, calloused hands and a deep, unwavering loyalty to his family. I knew Patricia would undoubtedly try to use that loyalty against me. I knew she would try to weaponize her own brother, spinning a web of lies to make him view me as the enemy. I had to get to him before her poison took permanent root in his mind. I called his number and asked him where his crew was working today. He told me they were framing a new custom build-out in a subdivision near Naperville. His voice sounded tight, guarded and stripped of its usual warmth. I told him I needed to see him in person right away. He hesitated for a long moment before giving me the address. I drove my heavy-duty work truck across the city, watching the gray clouds gather over the interstate. The biting cold wind off Lake Michigan rattled against my windows, but my mind was completely focused. I pulled into the muddy, unpaved driveway of the construction site. The skeletal wooden frame of a massive two-story house stood against the bleak sky. The sharp, echoing cracks of pneumatic nail guns and the smell of fresh-cut pine filled the crisp morning air. I saw Greg climb down from the second-floor scaffolding. He wiped his hands on his dusty denim jeans and walked over to where I had parked. I extended my hand to greet him, but Greg did not take it. He stopped a few feet away, crossing his thick arms over his chest. His face was set in a rigid, defensive scowl. He looked me squarely in the eyes and told me I should not be there. He said Patricia had called him in absolute hysterics at 6 a.m. He told me his sister was terrified of me. I stood in the freezing mud and listened as Greg repeated the meticulous, calculated lies my wife had been feeding him. Greg told me that Patricia had been confiding in him for months about my supposedly deteriorating mental state. She had convinced her brother that I was suffering from early-onset dementia. She told him I was becoming wildly paranoid, that I constantly forgot where I parked my service trucks, and that I was hiding money from her because my mind was failing. Greg's voice grew thick with a mixture of anger and pity as he accused me of becoming verbally abusive and entirely unstable. He said Patricia was only trying to protect our assets by freezing the bank accounts because she was terrified I would blindly give our life savings away in a state of cognitive decline. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or act defensive. I knew that demonstrating any erratic behavior or aggressive emotion was exactly what Patricia wanted. It would only validate the false psychological claims she had planted in his head. I looked at the man who had been my brother-in-law for 35 years, and I felt a deep sense of sorrow for him. He was a good, honest man who was being mercilessly manipulated by a predator. I kept my voice perfectly level and my hands completely visible. I told Greg that I understood why he was angry and that it was his fundamental duty to protect his sister. But I also told him that he had known me for 35 years. I asked him if he had ever in all those decades known me to be a liar, a cheat, or an unstable man. I asked him to trust the man standing in front of him right now, not the terrifying ghost his sister had invented over the telephone. I asked him for just 5 minutes on the tailgate of my truck to show him the absolute truth. Greg looked at my calm, steady expression. The fierce anger in his eyes flickered, replaced by a profound uncertainty. He let out a long, heavy sigh, his breath turning to white mist in the cold air. He nodded slowly and followed me to the back of my truck. I lowered the heavy steel tailgate. I reached into my canvas jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope and my heavy-duty commercial laptop. I placed the envelope on the metal surface and pulled out the freshly printed bank statements. I laid them out flat in front of him. I told Greg to look at the highlighted transaction lines. I explained that I was not the one draining our marital assets in a state of paranoia. I showed him the undeniable proof of $80,000 in unauthorized wire transfers, leaving our joint accounts and dropping directly into the corporate operating account of a slick real estate developer named Julian. Greg stared at the bank logs. He rubbed his bearded jaw, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He tried to rationalize it exactly as I expected an honest man would. He suggested that maybe Patricia was just making a legitimate real estate investment and was afraid to tell me because I was so strictly conservative with our money. I shook my head slowly. I told him I wished to God that was the case. I opened my laptop and woke up the screen. I told Greg that the bank transfers were just the final insult in a much larger, far more devastating betrayal. I navigated directly to the decrypted folder I had unlocked in my basement safe. I opened the exported archive of private emails and text messages between Patricia and Julian. I told Greg to read the screen. Greg leaned over the tailgate. He began to read the messages dated exactly 5 years ago. I watched his eyes scan the text. I watched as he read Julian's manipulative message begging Patricia for $250,000 in untraceable seed capital. I watched as he read Patricia's cold, calculating response detailing exactly how she planned to systematically embezzle $250,000 from the community outreach fund of her own church. The color completely drained from Greg's weathered face. He was a deeply devout man who attended that very church every single Sunday. He personally knew the families who had donated their hard-earned money to build that youth center. He read the exact messages where Julian coached his sister on how to manipulate the accounting ledgers and how to manufacture a fake gambling addiction to generate sympathy if the church board ever initiated a financial audit. Greg took a sudden step back from the truck. His rough, calloused hands began to shake violently. He looked at me, his eyes wide with absolute horror and disbelief. He stammered, asking how this was possible. He asked how the church had never noticed the missing funds, and how his sister was not currently sitting in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny. I looked him dead in the eyes and delivered the hardest truth of my life. I told him that the church never noticed the missing funds, because I had secretly replaced every single dime with my own blood and sweat. I explained that I had taken a massive, punishing second mortgage on my commercial heating and air conditioning business to cover her crime. I told him I had sacrificed my retirement, risked the livelihoods of my 30 employees, and worked myself to the bone for 5 brutal years to protect her reputation and keep her out of a concrete cell. I explained that my supposed cognitive decline and my financial paranoia were nothing but a smokescreen. Patricia was terrified I would expose her massive criminal fraud in the divorce proceedings, so she preemptively constructed a narrative to make me look completely insane. She wanted to lock me in a psychiatric ward so I could never testify against her. Greg gripped the edge of the steel tailgate so hard his knuckles turned pure white. The profound betrayal shattered his heart. He realized in that exact moment that his sister was not a distressed, frightened victim. She was a remorseless, calculating monster who was actively stealing from her own community and plotting to destroy the man who had sacrificed everything to save her. But I was not finished. I had one final devastating blow to deliver. I told Greg that Patricia had not just frozen my commercial operating accounts. I informed him that she had used her emergency court order to intentionally target and freeze the business accounts and personal savings of her own son, Lucas. I explained that she was deliberately trying to bankrupt her own child and freeze her infant granddaughter's college fund just to ensure Lucas could not help me hire a defense attorney. When Greg heard that Patricia had actively targeted her own son, the shock and sorrow on his face instantly hardened into an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. Family meant everything to Greg. The idea that a mother would deliberately orchestrate the financial ruin of her own child for her own selfish greed violated every single moral principle he held dear. He slammed his heavy fist down on the metal tailgate, causing the entire truck to shudder. He swore loudly, his voice echoing across the empty dirt lot. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He was furious. He told me he was going to call Patricia right now. He swore he was going to drive straight to her house, kick the front door down, and confront her for the disgusting, treacherous parasite she had become. I reached out and firmly gripped his wrist, stopping him from making the call. I told him that calling her in a blind rage was the absolute worst thing we could possibly do. I explained that if he confronted her now, she would instantly know that her psychological narrative had failed. She would realize I had decrypted the hidden emails, and she would panic. She would drain whatever liquid assets she had left, burn the digital evidence on her personal devices, and flee the jurisdiction with Julian before the courts could intervene. I told Greg that when a commercial building is rigged with explosives, you do not stand in the driveway and scream at it. You meticulously cut the power lines, you secure the perimeter, and you force the structure to collapse exactly where you want it to fall. I told him I needed his anger, but I needed it to be cold, sharp, and disciplined. I needed an ally who could walk behind enemy lines without raising a single alarm. Greg looked at my firm grip on his wrist. He took a slow, deep breath, forcing the violent rage back down into his chest. He put his cell phone back into his pocket and nodded slowly. He asked me exactly what I needed him to do. I laid out the strategy with the clinical precision of a veteran foreman organizing a massive commercial demolition. I told Greg that he was going to act as a double agent. He was going to play the role of the concerned, supportive brother perfectly. I instructed him to call Patricia back later that afternoon. I told him to feed her ego and validate her fabricated lies. He was going to tell her that I had showed up at his construction site looking completely unhinged, confused, and paranoid. He was going to report that I was begging for money and that I seemed entirely incapable of forming a coherent legal defense. He would assure her that her emergency financial freeze had completely broken my spirit and that I was weeks away from a total mental collapse. By feeding her this false information, we would inject her with a false, blinding sense of absolute security. Patricia was driven by a vicious arrogance. If she believed her trap had worked perfectly, she would become careless. She would continue communicating with Julian. She would move her hidden assets out into the open, and she would walk into the family court hearing believing she was entirely untouchable. Greg listened to the plan, a dark, silent understanding passing between us. He was a man who despised liars, and he was ready to help me build the ultimate snare for his own sister. He extended his rough, calloused hand over the tailgate of my truck. This time, there was no hesitation. I gripped his hand firmly, sealing an unbreakable alliance between two men who knew exactly how to protect their family. I closed my laptop and packed the decrypted evidence back into the heavy manila envelope. The first critical support beam of Patricia's fabricated legal fortress had been successfully severed. I had secured an operative on the inside, and her flow of information was now completely under my control. But the immediate financial crisis was still burning a hole through my logistics empire. I had less than 48 hours to bypass a massive federal banking freeze and secure the payroll for my entire commercial fleet. I thanked Greg for his loyalty, climbed back into the freezing cab of my truck, and drove out of the muddy construction site, ready to wage war on the second front. The cold wind whipped across the cracked asphalt of the industrial yard as I pulled my heavy work truck into my designated parking spot. I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the dark, corrugated steel of my commercial heating and air conditioning warehouse. It was Thursday morning. I had exactly 48 hours until the automated payroll system attempted to pull the weekly wages for my 30 mechanics and drivers. 48 hours until the banks would definitively reject the transactions, because Patricia had manipulated a family court judge into freezing every single asset tied to my name. 30 men depended on me. These were not just employees. They were the men who stood beside me on freezing commercial rooftops in the dead of winter. They were the men who missed dinners with their own families to help me fix blown compressors at local hospitals and grocery stores. They had mortgages to pay. They had children to feed. They had utility bills that would not wait for a bitter divorce dispute to be resolved in the county courts. Patricia knew this. She knew that if I failed to pay my men on Friday morning, the entire fleet would stop. My drivers would be forced to look for work elsewhere, and my contracts would default. She had designed this financial ambush specifically to break my spirit and crush my company into dust. I stepped out of the truck and felt the bitter chill seep into my bones. A younger man might have panicked. A weaker man might have called his wife and begged for mercy. But I spent 40 years working with my bare hands. I built this logistics and repair empire from a single rusted van. I survived economic recessions and brutal industry changes because I never relied on slick corporate tricks. I relied on the strength of my word and the respect of the men I did business with. Patricia thought she held all the power because she controlled the banking network. She completely forgot that in the blue-collar world, the true currency is not a plastic credit card. The true currency is a 30-year reputation built on absolute trust. I walked into my quiet office and grabbed my heavy leather ledger. I did not open my frozen email accounts or look at the locked digital banking portals. I made a list of 3 men. 3 men I had done business with for over 3 decades. I got back into my truck and drove to the south side of the city to a massive wholesale HVAC supply depot. The depot was a sprawling concrete building that smelled of machine oil and cut steel. I walked past the front counters and headed straight back to the loud loading docks. I was looking for a man named Edward. Edward owned the entire regional supply chain. We had started in this business together, back when we both had dirt under our fingernails and nothing in our pockets. I found him standing near a forklift, yelling instructions over the roar of the diesel engines. When he saw me, he smiled a wide, genuine smile and reached out to shake my rough hand. I did not waste his time with small talk. I asked him if we could step into his private office for 5 minutes. Once the heavy metal door clicked shut and blocked out the noise of the warehouse, I looked him dead in the eyes and told him the absolute truth. I told him my wife had filed a fraudulent court order to freeze my business accounts. I told him I was fighting a legal war to save my company and protect my son, but I had a catastrophic problem. I had 48 hours to make payroll and my pockets were completely empty. Edward did not flinch. He did not ask for a formal presentation or a digital credit score. He sat behind his dusty metal desk and looked at the tired lines on my face. He remembered the time my crew worked through a holiday weekend to fix the heating system in his own mother's house when the local grid failed. He remembered that in 40 years I had never once paid him late for a single spool of copper wire or a single commercial condenser. He opened his heavy desk drawer and pulled out a clean leather checkbook. He asked me exactly how much I needed to keep my 30 men paid and my trucks on the road for the next 2 weeks. I told him the exact figure. It was a massive sum. Without a single moment of hesitation, Edward wrote out a certified business check from his private reserve account. He handed it across the desk and told me to pay him back whenever the storm passed. We did not sign a contract. We simply shook hands. That firm grip was a bond stronger than any legal document Patricia could ever forge. But I could not stop there. I needed liquid cash to cover the immediate fuel costs for my fleet of service trucks. The diesel tanks needed to be filled by tomorrow morning, or the dispatch board would collapse. I left the supply depot and drove to the largest meatpacking plant in the county. It was an enormous industrial complex that relied heavily on massive commercial refrigeration units to keep their inventory safe. My company had maintained their primary chillers for 25 years. I walked into the executive suite and asked to speak directly to the owner. A stern older man named Robert came out of a meeting to see me. Robert was a man of strict discipline who did not tolerate excuses from anyone. I sat down with him in the main conference room. I told him my company was facing a sudden temporary banking freeze due to a malicious legal attack. I explained that I needed an immediate cash advance on our maintenance contract for the upcoming quarter to ensure my trucks could continue to service his facility without interruption. Robert stared at me from across the polished table. He was a ruthless businessman who usually demanded severe penalties for any deviation from a contract. But he also remembered the summer of 1998, when his main freezer unit catastrophically failed in the middle of a historic heat wave. He remembered that I had personally stayed awake for 36 straight hours, covered in grease and sweat, to rebuild the entire compressor system, saving his company millions of dollars in spoiled inventory. Robert did not call his legal department. He stood up, walked to his massive floor safe, and pulled out a thick envelope of emergency operating cash. He counted out the exact amount I needed for fuel and handed it to me. He looked me in the eyes and told me that a man who bleeds for his clients will never be left to drown alone. By Thursday evening, I had successfully bypassed the entire frozen banking network. I had secured enough capital to completely cover my payroll and my operating expenses based purely on the respect I had earned over 40 years of honest labor. I drove to an independent check cashing facility and converted the funds into certified cashier checks and cash envelopes for every single man on my roster. Friday morning arrived with a biting chill. The sky was a pale gray as my 30 mechanics and drivers gathered in the main warehouse for our weekly dispatch meeting. They stood around drinking hot coffee from thermos cups, completely unaware of the massive financial war I had just fought to keep their lives stable. I stood at the front of the room holding a heavy cardboard box. I did not give them a dramatic speech about my divorce or the betrayal of my wife. I simply called out their names one by one. I handed each man his pay for the week. I watched their tired faces light up with relief. I watched men holding the money that would pay their mortgages, buy their groceries, and support their children. Every time I handed over an envelope, I felt a profound, powerful warmth spreading through my chest. The crushing weight of the anxiety that had threatened to destroy me just 2 days ago was completely gone. My hands were calloused and scarred, but they had kept my empire standing. The trucks roared to life, filling the warehouse with the smell of diesel exhaust. My men drove out into the freezing city exactly on schedule, ready to work. The company had not died. The fleet had not stopped. I had won the first battle of the war. Miles away, in the comfort of our luxurious suburban home, Patricia was sitting at her imported marble kitchen island. She was wearing her expensive silk robe, staring intensely at her high-end laptop. According to the information Greg secretly provided to me later that afternoon, Patricia had spent the entire morning constantly refreshing the digital portal for our commercial banking accounts. She expected to see the cascade of catastrophic red warnings. She expected to see the automatic payroll system fail and collapse. She was waiting for the phone to ring so she could hear me begging for access to my own money. She wanted the absolute satisfaction of hearing a broken, desperate man surrender his entire life to her. But the banking portal showed absolutely zero activity. The accounts remained completely frozen and silent. Confused and growing increasingly agitated, Patricia called the main office of my heating and air conditioning company. She disguised her voice, pretending to be a commercial client inquiring about a service appointment. The young dispatcher on my desk answered the phone cheerfully. He proudly informed the supposed client that our entire fleet was currently fully operational on the road and completing every single scheduled job for the day without a single delay. When Patricia hung up the phone, a cold, sickening shock washed over her. She could not comprehend how a blue-collar mechanic had managed to fund a massive corporate payroll without access to a single bank account or a line of credit. Her brilliant, flawless strategy to financially suffocate me and force me into immediate submission had completely failed. I had slipped entirely through the cracks of her trap. The arrogant smirk she had worn for weeks vanished, leaving behind a mask of pure, vicious fury. She paced across the hardwood floors of the house she planned to steal from me. She realized that freezing the money was not enough to stop a man who had built his life on respect rather than plastic cards. Her psychological manipulation and her financial sabotage had not broken my mind or my business. She realized with terrifying clarity that as long as I was allowed to walk free and communicate with my blue-collar network, I would continue to fight her at every single turn. She could not simply starve me out. She needed to completely destroy my credibility and physically remove me from the board entirely. She picked up her phone and dialed the number of her slick, ruthless divorce attorney. She knew she had to escalate the war to a much darker and far more brutal level. She needed a tactic so aggressive and so damaging that no amount of goodwill from my commercial clients could ever save me from the absolute destruction she was about to unleash. The feeling of victory after paying my men was a brief and fragile thing. I stood in my office at the commercial heating and air conditioning warehouse, looking out the window at the empty parking lot. The sun was just starting to climb over the Chicago skyline, casting a pale gray light across the industrial park. My fleet was out on the road and my business was breathing, but I knew the silence would not last. Patricia was a woman who never accepted defeat. She viewed my survival as a direct insult to her intelligence. I knew she was sitting in our massive suburban home plotting her next move. I just did not realize how dark and how vicious that move would be until my cell phone vibrated on my desk. It was Greg. Patricia's brother was calling me on his secured work phone. When I answered, his voice was completely devoid of its usual calm contractor tone. He was breathing heavily, sounding deeply disturbed. He told me to sit down and listen very carefully. He said Patricia had just called him from the local police precinct. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Greg told me she was sobbing hysterically, claiming that I had driven to the house in a blind rage earlier that morning. She told the police that I had smashed the glass on the back patio door, forced my way into the kitchen, and physically threatened her life because my bank accounts were frozen. Greg said she was filing a fabricated domestic disturbance report and requesting an emergency restraining order against me. I felt the blood turn to ice water in my veins. The sheer evil of her strategy was breathtaking. In the state of Illinois, an emergency restraining order involving marital property can be weaponized with devastating efficiency. If a judge granted her that order, she would have the legal right to ban me from my own commercial warehouse. Since the business was technically a joint marital asset, the police would be forced to physically remove me from the property. Without my daily supervision and my vendor licenses, the entire logistics operation would instantly collapse. She was trying to achieve with a false police report what she had failed to achieve with the bank freeze. Greg told me the police were already on their way to the warehouse to serve the order and escort me off the premises. He apologized to me, his voice breaking with shame for what his own sister was doing. I told Greg he had absolutely nothing to apologize for. I thanked him for his loyalty and hung up the phone. A weaker man might have panicked. A man who was unprepared might have tried to run or call a lawyer in a state of absolute terror. But I am an old mechanic. I have spent my entire life planning for worst-case scenarios and building fail-safes into every system I touch. When Greg had agreed to act as my inside man days ago, I knew I had to prepare for extreme measures. I knew Patricia would eventually resort to desperate lies to destroy my credibility. I had anticipated a false accusation. That is why I had spent the entire previous weekend quietly upgrading the security systems on my commercial property and my service vehicles. I did not just install basic cameras. I installed commercial-grade, high-definition dashboard cameras in every single truck. These cameras recorded both the road and the cabin interior. They were permanently linked to a continuous global positioning satellite network. The system recorded my exact location, my speed, and a crystal-clear video feed with an unalterable digital timestamp. I sat behind my heavy wooden desk and turned my laptop monitor toward the door. I pulled up the primary dispatch software and logged into the master security portal. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, absolute resolve. I was going to let my wife spring her trap, and then I was going to use the jaws of that trap to completely crush her legal credibility. Less than 20 minutes later, the heavy silence of the industrial yard was broken by the sound of tires crunching on the gravel outside. I looked out the window and saw 2 city police cruisers pull into my loading dock area. Their red and blue lights were flashing, casting harsh, erratic shadows against the corrugated steel walls of the warehouse. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicles. They did not look relaxed. They moved with cautious, deliberate steps, placing their hands near their heavy utility belts. They had been briefed that they were dealing with a violent, unstable, and highly paranoid old man. The few employees I had working in the maintenance bay stopped what they were doing. They stared in absolute shock as the officers marched past the tool racks and headed straight for my front office. I did not hide. I did not lock the door. I stood up from my desk, keeping my hands perfectly visible and empty by my sides. I walked to the glass office door and opened it before they could even knock. The lead officer was a tall, stern man with graying hair. He stepped forward and asked if my name was Thomas. I replied politely and respectfully, confirming my identity. The officer did not smile. He handed me a thick stack of legal papers bearing the fresh ink signature of a county judge. He informed me in a hard, mechanical tone that a temporary emergency restraining order had been filed against me. He stated that I was required to immediately vacate the commercial premises and surrender my keys. He warned me that any resistance or aggressive behavior would result in my immediate arrest and incarceration. I looked at the young officers standing behind him. They were watching my every move, waiting for me to scream or throw a fit. I did none of those things. I simply took the paperwork and nodded. I told the lead officer that I fully understood his position and that I respected the difficult job he had to do. I told him I would gladly leave the property without causing a single issue, but I respectfully requested that he step inside my office for just 2 minutes before he forced me out into the cold. I explained that I was a commercial fleet owner and that I had hard physical evidence directly related to the sworn affidavit he was holding. The lead officer looked suspicious. Men accused of domestic violence always have excuses and elaborate stories. But my perfectly calm demeanor and my absolute lack of aggression made him pause. He signaled for the other officers to wait by the door, and he stepped into my small office. I pointed to the chair across from my desk, but he chose to stand. I picked up the restraining order and read the specific details of Patricia's fabricated story. She claimed under penalty of perjury that I had arrived at our suburban home at exactly 9 in the morning. She swore that I had broken the patio window and screamed threats at her for 20 minutes before fleeing the scene. I looked up at the officer and asked him if filing a false police report and committing perjury to obtain a protective order was a criminal offense. The officer narrowed his eyes and confirmed that it was a severe state crime. I turned my laptop screen so he could see it clearly. I told the officer that I had not been anywhere near my suburban house that morning. I explained that at exactly 9 in the morning, I was standing on the icy roof of a commercial shopping center in Schaumburg, 30 miles away, repairing a massive industrial condenser unit. I clicked the first file on my dispatch portal. The screen illuminated with the global positioning satellite log from my personal work truck. The digital map clearly showed my truck leaving the warehouse at 7 in the morning, driving straight to Schaumburg, and remaining parked at the commercial shopping center until 11 in the morning. The unalterable satellite data proved my vehicle was miles away from my wife during the entire window of the alleged attack. The officer leaned over the desk, his expression shifting from stern authority to cautious curiosity. He noted the digital timestamps embedded in the federal satellite tracking software. But I knew that a simple tracking log was not enough to completely destroy her lie. I needed to show him undeniable visual proof. I clicked the second file, The screen switched to the high-definition dashboard camera footage from my truck. The video showed the icy highway, the arrival at the shopping center, and my truck parking near the loading docks. The interior cabin camera showed me sitting in the driver's seat drinking coffee and filling out a work order at exactly 9 in the morning. The digital clock on the bottom of the video feed ticked away, proving my exact location second by second. I did not stop there. I clicked the third and final file. This was a video feed from the commercial security camera mounted on the shopping center roof, which my company had access to for maintenance liability purposes. The video clearly showed me wearing my heavy canvas jacket and my safety harness walking across the frozen roof. At exactly 9:15 minutes, the exact moment Patricia claimed I was smashing her patio door, I was visibly on camera, hoisting a heavy Freon tank and talking to a commercial property manager. I let the video play in total silence. The loud hum of the warehouse heaters echoed through the walls. The lead officer stood perfectly still, staring at the glowing monitor. He watched me working on the roof miles away from the crime scene. The aggressive defensive posture he had walked in with completely dissolved. The reality of the situation crashed down on him with absolute clarity. He had not been sent here to protect a terrified victim. He had been weaponized by a calculating predator who was trying to steal a commercial business. I looked at the officer and spoke in a quiet, steady voice. I told him that my wife was currently engaged in a massive financial fraud. I explained that she was trying to use his uniform and his badge to bypass a legal divorce proceeding and physically lock me out of my own company. I told him that the broken window at my house was either a complete fabrication or a staged act of vandalism. She committed herself to justify the police report. The lead officer let out a long, heavy sigh. He took his radio off his belt and stepped out of my office. He walked over to the other officers and spoke to them in hushed, urgent tones. I watched through the glass as the young officers looked at me, their expressions changing from hostility to profound professional embarrassment. They realized they had been played for absolute fools. The lead officer walked back into my office. He closed the door behind him and took off his uniform cap. He looked me directly in the eyes and apologized. He told me that based on the undeniable time-stamped video evidence, the emergency restraining order was fundamentally invalid. He explained that he could not legally force me to vacate my commercial property when the underlying affidavit was a proven, verifiable work of perjury. He asked me to copy all the video files and the satellite tracking logs onto a portable drive. He told me he was returning to the precinct to officially file a massive contradictory report against my wife. He explained that Patricia's decision to file a false police report to manipulate a judge was a felony, and her credibility with the local court system was now completely and permanently destroyed. Any future claims she made would be viewed with extreme prejudice and extreme suspicion. I copied the files onto a drive and handed it to him. I thanked him for his integrity and his willingness to look at the truth. The officers left my warehouse walking back to their cruisers with a heavy, frustrated energy. The flashing red and blue lights turned off, and the cars rolled quietly out of the industrial yard. I sat back down in my desk chair and let out a long, slow breath. Patricia had fired her most desperate and vicious weapon at me. She had tried to use the absolute power of the state to rip my life's work out of my hands. But she had failed catastrophically. By launching this false attack, she had unknowingly handed me the exact evidence I needed to prove to a judge that she was a relentless, manipulative liar. Her entire legal narrative was beginning to fracture and crumble under the weight of her own arrogance. I looked at the phone on my desk. I knew Greg would be calling soon to give me an update on her reaction. I knew that when the police arrived at her massive suburban home to question her about the false report, she would realize her trap had shattered. She would realize I was not a weak, paranoid old man. I was a man who planned for every contingency. The war was far from over, but the tide had definitively turned. Patricia had drawn the absolute worst kind of attention to herself, and I was perfectly positioned to watch her empire burn to the ground. The weekend arrived with a heavy gray sky that matched the cold exhaustion settling deep into my bones. The immediate threat of the police raid had been neutralized, and my men had their paychecks in their hands. But the war was taking a physical toll on me. I was sitting in my warehouse office late Saturday afternoon, surrounded by towering stacks of vendor invoices and printed dispatch logs. Because Patricia had successfully frozen my digital banking portals, I had to resort to running my entire commercial heating and air conditioning fleet on paper. It was a massive administrative nightmare. I was manually cross-referencing thousands of dollars in commercial supply orders, trying to keep the supply chain moving without triggering any further legal traps. My son Lucas had refused to stay home, despite the fact that Patricia had deliberately targeted his own information technology firm and frozen his personal accounts. Lucas drove straight to my warehouse. He was 35 years old, but walking through the heavy steel doors of the maintenance bay, he looked like a terrified child. His face was pale, and he was running on pure adrenaline and fear. He told me he could not just sit in his house and wait for the court system to destroy his life. He wanted to help me sort through the financial rubble. He wanted to understand exactly how deep his mother's betrayal went. I told Lucas to take a seat at the secondary desk in the corner of my office. I gave him a stack of operational expense reports and asked him to tally the fuel costs for the upcoming week. I wanted to keep his mind occupied with simple math. I did not want him digging into the darkest corners of my past. I wanted to protect him from the full, agonizing truth about his mother for as long as I possibly could. I thought I had secured all the evidence in my floor safe. I thought the decrypted files were safely hidden away on my secondary dispatch server. I was an old mechanic trying to manage a digital battlefield, and I made a critical error in judgment. I forgot that my son was a brilliant corporate network architect. Around 6 in the evening, the heavy industrial heater in the warehouse kicked on with a loud metallic groan. I stood up from my desk, rubbing my aching lower back. I told Lucas I was going out to the main maintenance bay to check the freon levels on truck number 4 and to grab us some black coffee from the break room. Lucas nodded without looking up from the paperwork. He looked exhausted, rubbing his temples as he scanned the printed numbers. I walked out of the office and pulled the glass door shut behind me, leaving him completely alone. I should have locked my primary filing cabinet. I should have realized that a man searching for answers will inevitably open the wrong drawer. While I was out in the freezing warehouse checking pressure gauges, Lucas finished tallying the fuel logs. He needed to find the previous quarter's commercial loan statements to cross-reference our available credit. He pulled open the heavy bottom drawer of my metal filing cabinet. It was the drawer where I kept my most sensitive corporate documents. He was looking for standard equipment financing papers. Instead, his hands brushed against a thick, unlabeled manila envelope hidden all the way in the back behind a stack of tax returns. Lucas is a meticulous man. He pulled the envelope out and opened it, expecting to find outdated warranty contracts. What he pulled out was a printed transcript of the massive private commercial loan I had taken out 5 years ago. He stared at the documents in utter confusion. He read the loan origination date. He looked at the principal amount of $250,000. None of it made any logical sense to him. He knew exactly how profitable my commercial fleet was 5 years ago. We had just secured 3 massive hospital contracts. We were drowning in revenue. There was absolutely no legitimate business reason for a conservative, debt-averse mechanic like me to suddenly leverage his entire company and take out a punishing $250,000 second mortgage. Lucas spread the loan documents across the desk. His highly analytical mind began to race. He looked at the amortization schedules and the aggressive interest rates. He realized that this specific loan was the exact reason I had stopped taking family vacations. This was the reason I had worked every single weekend for the last 5 years, destroying my knees and my back. He realized he was looking at the financial anchor that had been quietly dragging me underwater. But the documents did not explain where the money went. There were no receipts for new trucks or warehouse expansions. The $250,000 had simply vanished into thin air, driven by a desperate need for answers. Lucas turned his attention to my main desktop computer. He knew I kept digital backups of every single corporate transaction. He bypassed my basic password screen using a simple administrative override he had taught me years ago. He opened my primary hard drive and began searching for the loan origination date, but he did not find standard banking files. He noticed a massive anomaly in the storage allocation of my secondary dispatch server. He saw the hidden partition I had created just days ago when I backed up the decrypted folder from the flash drive. For a corporate information technology consultant, cracking a localized hidden folder on a standard desktop computer was a matter of seconds. He ran a swift decryption script bypassing the security wall I had hastily thrown together. The hidden folder burst open on his screen. Lucas leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. He saw the exported archives of text messages. He saw the high-definition security video file. The file name was simply a date from 5 years ago. The exact same month the massive commercial loan was originated. With a trembling hand, Lucas moved the mouse and clicked on the video file. The screen illuminated with the grainy black and white security footage of our local church administration room. I was walking back across the warehouse floor holding 2 steaming cups of black coffee when I looked through the glass window of my office. I stopped dead in my tracks. The coffee splashed over the rims of the paper cups, burning my knuckles, but I did not feel the heat. I saw my son sitting frozen in the glow of the computer monitor. He was completely motionless. I pushed the glass door open and stepped inside the warm office. The sound of the video playing filled the small room. I heard the distinct metallic jingle of keys and the heavy thud of a canvas deposit bag hitting a wooden desk. I looked at the monitor. The footage showed Patricia sneaking into the church office late at night, looking frantically over her shoulder. The camera captured her zipping stacks of donated community cash into her expensive designer purse. Lucas was watching his own mother steal $250,000 from their own congregation. He was watching the woman who had raised him, the woman who had baked his birthday cakes and taught him right from wrong, committing grand larceny with cold, calculated precision. He watched as the video ended and the screen faded to black. He did not look away from the monitor. He immediately clicked on the next file in the folder. It was the archive of text messages between Patricia and Julian. I took a step forward, wanting to slam the laptop shut, wanting to shield him from the toxic poison radiating from that screen. But my boots felt like they were cast in solid lead. I could not move. I had to let him see the absolute truth. Lucas read the messages. He read Julian manipulating his mother, begging for untraceable seed capital to start his real estate firm. He read his mother eagerly detailing her plan to bleed the church youth center fund dry. He read the exact messages where they conspired to manufacture a fake gambling addiction just in case she was ever caught. He read how she planned to play the desperate victim to avoid federal prison. The silence in the office was absolutely deafening. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing coming from my son's chest. He slowly pushed the keyboard away from him. He reached out and picked up the printed commercial loan documents from the desk. He looked at the massive $250,000 principal amount. He looked at my signature on the bottom line, binding me to 5 years of agonizing, brutal labor. He placed the papers back down on the desk. He slowly turned his chair around to face me. I have seen men break their bones on construction sites. I have seen men weep at funerals. but I have never seen an expression of such absolute total devastation on a human face. The color had completely vanished from his skin. His eyes were wide and swimming with thick, heavy tears. He was looking at me, but he was seeing the last 5 years of our lives through an entirely new, terrifying lens. The realization hit him with the force of a runaway freight train. The pieces all snapped together in a brutal, violent sequence in his mind. He realized that his father had not destroyed the family finances. His father was not a paranoid old man suffering from cognitive decline. His father was a man who had intentionally walked into a financial fire to save his family. Lucas stood up from the chair. His legs were shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of the heavy wooden desk to keep from collapsing. He looked at my calloused hands, still holding the 2 cups of coffee. He looked at my worn canvas jacket and the deep, tired lines etched into my face. He realized that the woman he called his mother had not just made a mistake. She was a remorseless predator. She had stolen from her own community to fund her arrogant lover. And when she was caught, she allowed her husband to sacrifice his entire retirement, his physical health, and his peace of mind to keep her out of a federal penitentiary. She watched me break my back for 5 years to pay her debt, and instead of feeling gratitude, she grew arrogant and cruel. And worst of all, Lucas realized that her current legal attack, freezing his business accounts and holding his own daughter's college fund hostage, was not a desperate reaction to a divorce. It was a calculated strike to eliminate any financial support I might have. She was actively trying to bankrupt her own son just to ensure that I would be left completely defenseless in family court. She was willing to throw her own child into the meat grinder just to protect her stolen wealth. The tears finally spilled over his eyelids, tracking down his pale cheeks. He did not yell. He did not curse. His voice came out as a broken, agonizing whisper that tore straight through my heart. He asked me how long I had known. He asked me why I had carried this massive, crushing burden entirely alone. He asked me why I let her treat me with such absolute disrespect for 5 long years without ever saying a single word. I set the coffee cups down on a nearby filing cabinet. I walked across the room and stood in front of my son. I looked deep into his eyes and told him the only truth that mattered. I told him I did it for him. I explained that 5 years ago he was just starting his information technology firm. He had just gotten married and was expecting his first child. I told him I could not bear the thought of his mother being dragged out of her home in federal handcuffs. I could not bear the thought of my granddaughter growing up with a grandmother in a maximum security prison. I wanted to protect their image of our family. I believed that if I just paid the money back and carried the secret, Patricia would eventually change. I believed my sacrifice would buy us peace. I placed my heavy hands on his shaking shoulders. I told him I was a foolish, naive old man. I apologized to him for not protecting him from her current financial ambush. I told him I was so profoundly sorry that he had to find out the truth this way in a cold, dusty warehouse office. Lucas shook his head. He reached up and grabbed my forearms, holding on to me with a fierce, desperate strength. He pulled me into a tight, crushing embrace. He buried his face against the shoulder of my canvas jacket and wept. He cried for the mother he had just lost, and he cried for the father who had sacrificed absolutely everything to keep the family standing. We stood there in the quiet office, holding on to each other, while the reality of the war settled around us. When he finally pulled away, he wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. The devastating sorrow in his eyes slowly hardened into something entirely different. The tears stopped falling. His posture straightened, and his jaw locked with a rigid, unyielding tension. The shock was gone, replaced by a cold, brilliant fury. He looked at the glowing computer monitor displaying the decrypted messages between his mother and Julian. He looked at the massive commercial loan documents sitting on the desk. He realized that his mother was not just attacking me. She had declared war on our entire family. Lucas told me that Patricia thought she had completely outsmarted a blue-collar mechanic. She thought her emergency ex parte motions and her frozen bank accounts made her untouchable. But she had made the exact same catastrophic miscalculation that Julian had made. She had completely forgotten that she was picking a fight with a veteran structural foreman and a corporate network architect. He walked back over to my desk and sat down in the heavy leather chair. He pulled the keyboard toward him, and his fingers hovered over the keys. He told me that Patricia had used the legal system to freeze our assets, but she was still communicating with Julian using digital networks. He explained that arrogant criminals always leave a digital trail, and he knew exactly how to track it down. He was going to use his expertise to bypass Julian's corporate firewalls and extract every single piece of financial data, connecting them to the embezzled church funds. I stood behind him, placing a hand on his shoulder as he began to type. We were no longer just a father trying to survive a bitter divorce. We were a united front operating with absolute brutal clarity. Patricia had tried to divide and conquer us. She had tried to suffocate us into silent submission. Instead, she had unknowingly forged the exact alliance that was going to tear her entire world straight down to the bedrock. We had the evidence, we had the drive, and we were ready to burn her fabricated kingdom to the ground. Lucas stood in the center of my dusty warehouse office with the harsh fluorescent light buzzing overhead. The glow of the computer monitor cast long shadows across his pale face. He had just witnessed the absolute destruction of his family history on that screen. He had watched the security footage of his own mother stealing community funds, and he had read the cold calculations of her betrayal. I watched my son struggle to process a reality that completely shattered the foundation of his life. He looked at me with eyes heavy with a profound and agonizing sorrow. He took a slow and shaky breath before he finally spoke. He walked toward me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders. He was a grown man, with a wife and a child of his own, but in that moment, he sounded like a little boy lost in the dark. He buried his face in my heavy canvas jacket and began to apologize. He apologized over and over again, his voice breaking with every word. He told me he was so sorry for ever doubting me. He told me he felt like a fool for believing even a fraction of the lies Patricia had spread about my mental state. He wept because he realized I had allowed myself to be painted as an absent, exhausted old man just to protect him from knowing the monstrous truth about his mother. I wrapped my thick, calloused arms around my son and held him tight. I told him he had absolutely nothing to apologize for. I spoke in a quiet and steady voice, explaining that it is the most natural thing in the world for a son to trust the woman who gave him life. I told him that Patricia had spent decades perfecting her mask. She was a master of appearances. She knew exactly how to smile at church and how to play the devoted mother while harboring a heart full of pure greed. I told Lucas that I never wanted him to carry this terrible burden. I wanted to take the secret to my grave so he could keep the image of a perfect family intact. Lucas stepped back and wiped the tears from his cheeks. His sorrow was rapidly transforming into a fierce and disciplined anger. He looked at the printed commercial loan documents scattered across my desk. He pointed at the massive principal amount and asked me why the war was happening right now. He asked why, after 5 long years of silently paying off the money she had stolen, I had finally decided to file for divorce and trigger this catastrophic battle. I walked over to the desk and pulled up a secondary file on my computer. I knew I had to tell him the rest of the story. I explained that for 5 years I had kept my head down and worked myself to the bone. I paid the bank every single month. I replaced the stolen church funds anonymously, and I thought the bleeding had finally stopped. I believed that Patricia had learned her lesson, and that the terror of almost going to federal prison had scared her straight. But I was completely wrong. I told Lucas that a few months ago I noticed strange discrepancies in our joint personal savings accounts. Small amounts were missing at first. $2,000 here and $5,000 there. It was a slow and systematic drain. Because I had spent years managing the massive cash flow of a commercial heating and air conditioning fleet, I knew exactly how to track missing capital. I did my own quiet investigation. I discovered that Patricia was funneling our personal savings directly into dummy corporate accounts controlled by Julian. Her young real estate lover had completely failed to build the empire he had promised her. His commercial property flips were defaulting, and he was drowning in debt. I looked my son straight in the eyes and laid out Patricia's ultimate endgame. I explained that she was not just leaving me for another man. Julian needed a massive injection of liquid cash to save his failing business. The only asset large enough to cover his catastrophic debts was my commercial HVAC fleet. Patricia had intentionally pushed me toward a divorce so she could initiate a hostile division of assets. She wanted the court to force the liquidation of my warehouse, my service trucks, and my entire corporate infrastructure. She planned to take her half of the settlement, which would be worth millions, and hand it straight to Julian. She was willing to destroy the jobs of my 30 loyal mechanics and bankrupt her own son just to secure a final payday for a predatory con artist. When Lucas heard the full extent of her strategy, a cold and terrifying silence filled the room. The last remnants of the loving mother he once knew evaporated from his mind. He realized that Patricia viewed all of us as nothing more than disposable assets. He looked at me with a jaw set in absolute stone. He told me that Patricia and Julian thought they were incredibly smart. They thought they had engineered a flawless financial ambush. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had completely forgotten what Lucas did for a living. My son is not a mechanic. He does not turn wrenches or install heavy commercial compressors. Lucas is a senior corporate network architect. He spends his days designing encrypted digital infrastructures for massive financial institutions and healthcare networks. He understands how data moves across the world, and he knows exactly how to track people who think they are hiding in the shadows. Lucas pulled my heavy leather chair out from behind the desk and sat down in front of my computer. He cracked his knuckles, and his eyes locked onto the screen with a sharp, predatory focus. He told me that if Julian was running a failing real estate firm, he was inevitably cutting corners on his digital security. Lucas explained that arrogant people always leave a trail of electronic breadcrumbs because they believe no one is smart enough to follow them. He opened a complex diagnostic program on my computer. The screen turned black and filled with rapidly scrolling lines of green code. Lucas asked me for the exact email addresses and domain names Patricia had used to communicate with Julian in the decrypted files we had already found. I read the information off my notepad. Lucas began to type with a blinding speed. He explained his process to me in simple terms as his fingers flew across the keyboard. He told me he was doing a reverse lookup on the server network that hosted Julian's real estate company. Within minutes, Lucas discovered that Julian was using a cheap, outdated commercial server to host all of his business emails and internal financial documents. It was a digital fortress built out of wet cardboard. Lucas did not even have to use aggressive hacking tools. He simply spoofed an administrative credential request and slipped right through Julian's poorly configured security firewall. I stood behind my son and watched as he gained full unauthorized access to the entire back end of Julian's corporate life. Lucas opened the primary directory and began searching for keywords related to my company, my name, and my wife. The search results flooded the screen in a matter of seconds. Lucas began opening the internal emails Julian had sent to his own private defense attorneys and his shady business partners. What we found in those digital files was a level of cruelty and deception that went far beyond anything I had ever imagined. Julian was not just manipulating Patricia. He secretly despised her. Lucas clicked on an email thread dated just 3 weeks ago. It was a conversation between Julian and one of his aggressive real estate investors who was demanding immediate repayment for a defaulted loan. Julian replied to the investor with a tone of supreme, arrogant confidence. He promised the investor that a massive influx of cash was only a few months away. I read the words on the screen and felt my stomach turn. Julian explicitly referred to my wife as an aging, gullible cash cow. He bragged to his business partner about how easy it was to manipulate an older woman who was desperate for attention. He laid out his entire exit strategy in plain, undeniable text. He wrote that as soon as Patricia secured the court-ordered liquidation of my commercial heating and air conditioning fleet, he was going to take her settlement money to cover his debts. And the very moment the bank transfers cleared, he was going to completely cut ties with her. He explicitly stated that he had absolutely no intention of spending his life with an older woman once her financial utility was exhausted. He was going to take my life savings leave, Patricia completely bankrupt, and disappear. I looked at Lucas. He was reading the same words. The sheer, bitter irony of the situation hung heavy in the cold warehouse air. Patricia had destroyed her marriage of 35 years. She had alienated her own children. She had lied to a judge, committed federal perjury, and tried to financially ruin her own son. She had burned her entire world to the ground, believing she was walking away with a wealthy younger man. But she was actually walking straight into a slaughterhouse. Julian was a parasite who was planning to butcher her the moment she handed over the meat. Lucas did not say a word. He simply highlighted the entire archive of emails and initiated a secure download. He pulled a fresh encrypted flash drive from his own backpack and transferred every single piece of damning evidence onto the device. He made 3 separate digital backups, sending one to a secure offshore cloud server that he managed for his own corporate clients. He ensured that no matter what Patricia or Julian tried to do to my physical property, the digital evidence would survive. When the downloads were completely finished, Lucas closed the terminal and wiped his digital footprints from Julian's server. He stood up from the desk and turned to face me. His eyes were hard, and his posture was completely rigid. The weeping boy who had walked into my office an hour ago was gone. In his place stood a fierce, intelligent man who was fully prepared to defend his family. Lucas told me that we were not going to warn Patricia. We were not going to show her the emails and save her from Julian's ultimate betrayal. He said that a woman who is willing to freeze her own granddaughter's college fund deserves exactly what is coming to her. He told me that we were going to let Patricia walk into the final family court hearing completely blind to the reality of her situation. We were going to let her stand before the judge and double down on her fabricated lies. And then we were going to hand this mountain of unassailable digital evidence to my lawyer and watch the entire justice system collapse directly onto her head. I felt a profound surge of pride swell in my chest. I had spent my entire life trying to be a shield for my family. I had taken the blows, I had carried the debt, and I had suffered in silence because I believed it was my duty as a father. But looking at Lucas, I realized I did not have to fight this war alone anymore. My son was standing shoulder to shoulder with me. We had bridged the gap between my blue-collar grit and his modern digital warfare. I reached out and gripped his shoulder firmly. I told him he had done a brilliant job. I told him that his mother thought she could use the legal system as a weapon, but she did not understand that we had just dismantled the very ground she was standing on. We spent the next 2 hours printing physical hard copies of the most devastating emails and the detailed bank transfers. We organized the documents into a thick, heavy binder. We paired the printed emails with the high-definition security footage of Patricia stealing the church funds and the time-stamped dashboard camera videos proving her domestic disturbance report was a total work of perjury. We built a chronological, undeniable timeline of a massive criminal conspiracy. By the time we finally turned off the lights in the warehouse office, the sun had completely set. The industrial yard outside was bathed in darkness, and the bitter Chicago wind was howling against the steel walls. But inside the cab of my work truck, as Lucas and I drove away, there was only a calm and absolute certainty. We had forged an unbreakable alliance. We had secured the lifeblood of my commercial fleet. We had mapped every single one of our enemies' movements. Patricia and Julian believed they were waiting for an exhausted, broken old mechanic to finally surrender. They had no idea that in exactly 5 days they were going to walk into a courtroom and face an execution squad. The morning of the final family court hearing arrived with a bitter, freezing rain that washed the streets of Chicago in a dull, heavy gray light. I drove my heavy-duty work truck into the downtown financial district with my son Lucas sitting in the passenger seat beside me. We did not speak much on the drive to the courthouse. We did not need to fill the silence with useless chatter. We had spent the last 5 days meticulously preparing our response to the most vicious attack of my life. We had the thick, heavy binder of printed emails, financial records, and time-stamped security photographs sitting securely inside my battered brown leather briefcase. We walked up the wide concrete steps of the county courthouse. The building was an imposing, massive structure made of cold marble and polished brass. It was a place explicitly designed to make a man feel small and intimidated. But I did not feel small. I felt the quiet, solid strength of a man who has built his entire life on concrete and steel. I knew exactly what I was carrying in my briefcase, and I knew exactly what was about to happen. We took the crowded elevator up to the family court division on the 4th floor. The long hallway was filled with anxious people waiting for their lives to be divided and judged by strangers. We walked through the heavy wooden double doors into courtroom number 4. It was a sterile, intimidating room with dark oak benches and harsh, buzzing fluorescent lighting. I walked past the gallery and sat down at the defense table next to my attorney. My lawyer was a sharp, highly observant man named Davis. I had hired Davis specifically because he was not a loud, flashy showman. He understood the profound value of strategic patience. He knew that when your enemy is proudly destroying themselves, you never interrupt them. Lucas took a seat directly behind me in the wooden gallery pews. I could feel his presence like a solid, unbreakable anchor at my back. A few minutes later, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Patricia walked in, accompanied by her high-priced, slick divorce attorney. I turned my head and watched her carefully. She had dressed specifically and strategically for the exact part she was about to play. She was wearing a modest, pale blue blouse and a simple, long gray skirt. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and her makeup was minimal, deliberately designed to make her look tired, stressed, and profoundly vulnerable. It was a brilliant, highly calculated costume. She looked exactly like a woman who had spent years suffering in terrible silence. She walked slowly to the plaintiff table, keeping her head down and completely avoiding my gaze. Her lawyer, on the other hand, walked with the arrogant, confident, bouncing stride of a man who believed he had already won the war before the first shot was even fired. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit and carried a sleek, imported leather briefcase. He arranged his expensive gold pens and his perfectly printed document folders on the wooden table with a smug, highly satisfied expression. The bailiff called the room to order and announced the arrival of the judge. We all stood as a stern-looking older man in a heavy black robe took his seat at the high, elevated bench. He looked over his reading glasses at the thick files stacked in front of him. He was a veteran family court judge who had likely presided over thousands of bitter, angry divorces. He cleared his throat, arranged his papers, and formally asked the plaintiff to begin their opening statement. Patricia's lawyer stood up proudly and buttoned his expensive suit jacket. He stepped out from behind his table, approached the center of the room, and began to weave a masterful, horrifying work of absolute fiction. His voice was smooth, clinical, and laced with a toxic, heavy dose of fake empathy. He told the judge that this was a deeply tragic and heartbreaking case. He said he was representing a devoted, loyal wife who had spent 35 years selflessly supporting her husband, only to be subjected to severe emotional and financial abuse in her twilight years. He paced back and forth in front of the judge, spinning his dark web of lies with incredible dramatic flair. He claimed that over the last 5 years, my mental state had rapidly and dangerously deteriorated. He used the exact poison Patricia had planted in her brother's mind. He called me wildly paranoid, totally unstable, and deeply disconnected from reality. He told the judge that I had completely lost my grip on my commercial heating and air conditioning business. He painted a vivid picture of an old, confused mechanic who was blindly making disastrous financial decisions and single-handedly threatening the survival of the entire family estate. Then the lawyer brought up the massive commercial loan. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at me and told the judge that 5 years ago I had secretly and recklessly mortgaged my entire company for $250,000. He claimed I had hidden this massive, crushing debt from my innocent wife, and that the funds had completely vanished without a single trace. He told the court that my profound cognitive decline had turned me into a dangerous financial liability. He said Patricia had lived in constant daily terror that I would bankrupt them both and leave her destitute on the street. He explicitly stated that her recent decision to file emergency ex parte motions and freeze my commercial business accounts was a desperate, necessary act of pure survival to stop an unstable man from destroying their life savings. Sitting at the defense table, I listened to this spectacular lie. I thought about the freezing winter nights I had spent on commercial rooftops, destroying my knees and my back to pay off that exact $250,000 loan. I thought about how I had sacrificed my own retirement and my own physical health to anonymously replace the church funds she had stolen to keep her out of a federal penitentiary. To hear her lawyer stand in a court of law and use my profound silent sacrifice as proof of my supposed insanity was sickening. But I kept my face perfectly blank. I did not react. The lawyer did not stop there. He rapidly escalated his ruthless attack to the fabricated domestic disturbance report. His voice grew loud and highly dramatic as he recounted the completely false events of that Thursday morning. He told the judge that when I discovered the bank accounts were legally frozen, I completely snapped and lost all control. He described how I supposedly drove to the suburban house, smashed the patio glass in a violent rage, and physically terrorized his client for 20 minutes before fleeing the scene like a coward. He pointed to the emergency restraining order as undeniable physical proof of my violent, unhinged nature. He conveniently completely ignored the fact that the city police had refused to enforce that order after seeing my time-stamped dashboard camera footage. He simply used the existence of the police report to paint me as a volatile, dangerous physical threat to a helpless older woman. While her lawyer delivered this venomous speech, Patricia executed her performance flawlessly. She sat at the plaintiff table with her shoulders slumped, clutching a crumpled white tissue in her trembling hands. Every single time the lawyer mentioned my supposed abuse or her supposed terror, she dabbed at her eyes and let out a soft, shaking sob. She looked perfectly pitiful. She looked exactly like a woman who had endured unimaginable cruelty and was begging the legal system for mercy. I sat at my table and watched her with a cold, detached, clinical fascination. I thought about the decrypted emails sitting right next to me in my briefcase. I thought about her laughing with Julian, plotting to steal the community youth center funds and mocking my blind dedication. Watching her cry these fake, calculated tears in front of a judge was a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. She was a predator, wearing the skin of a victim. After fully establishing me as a paranoid, abusive monster, the lawyer moved to his final list of demands. He addressed the judge with absolute, unshakable confidence. He stated that because of my severe cognitive decline and my proven history of financial sabotage, I was completely unfit to manage any marital assets. He requested that the court immediately and permanently strip me of my ownership of the commercial heating and air conditioning fleet. He demanded that Patricia be awarded 100% total control of the business so she could liquidate the assets, sell the trucks, and recover the funds I had supposedly squandered. He continued reading from his perfectly printed list. He demanded that Patricia be granted sole absolute ownership of our massive suburban house. He demanded that I be ordered to pay her lifetime maximum alimony to compensate for the severe emotional trauma I had inflicted upon her over the last 5 years. Finally, he asked the judge to permanently extend the emergency restraining order banning me from my own warehouse, my own property, and my own life. He wanted me thrown out on the street with absolutely nothing stripped of my company, my 30-year reputation, and my basic human dignity. Through this entire blistering attack, I did not react. I kept my rough, calloused hands folded quietly on the wooden table. I did not shake my head or scoff. I did not interrupt. My lawyer Davis sat next to me, perfectly still, taking slow, deliberate notes on a yellow legal pad. He did not object to a single word the opposing counsel said. We sat in absolute disciplined silence and let Patricia's lawyer build a towering, fragile castle of lies. We let him dig the hole as deep as he possibly could. The judge listened to the entire speech with a grim, deeply serious expression. He looked down at Patricia with visible sympathy. He watched her wipe her eyes with her tissue and nodded gently, acknowledging her supposed pain. Then he turned his gaze directly to me. I could see the profound pity and disgust swimming in his eyes. He looked at me exactly the way Patricia wanted him to look at me. He saw a broken, bitter old man who had lost his mind and violently ruined his family. He saw an abuser who deserved to be stripped of his assets and severely punished by the full, crushing weight of the legal system. Patricia's lawyer finished his opening statement with a dramatic, heavy sigh, expressing profound sorrow for the tragic end of a long marriage. He thanked the judge respectfully and sat down next to Patricia, gently patting her hand to comfort her. The courtroom was silent. The heavy, tense air of impending doom filled the space. Lucas shifted slightly in the wooden pew behind me, his boots scuffing the floor. The judge adjusted his glasses and flipped through the thick file of fabricated claims provided by the plaintiff. He folded his hands together and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the high bench. He addressed my lawyer directly. His voice was tired, bureaucratic, and formal, ready to issue a devastating legal ruling that would hand my entire life over to a calculating predator. The judge stated that the plaintiff had presented a deeply concerning and severe account of financial recklessness and domestic instability. He noted that the requested asset seizure and the total transfer of the commercial business were extreme measures, but potentially highly justified, given the alleged cognitive decline and the emergency protective orders currently on file. The judge looked directly at me and then at Davis. He asked, in a flat, routine tone, if the defense had any final statements or any physical evidence to present before he officially ruled on the permanent asset seizure and the complete transfer of the commercial property. He waited for us to surrender. Patricia stared at the table, a faint, satisfied smirk hiding just behind her white tissue. She believed the war was completely over. She believed she had won. The heavy silence in courtroom number 4 felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. The judge looked down at me from his elevated bench, waiting for my surrender. Patricia sat across the room, dabbing her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue, waiting for the final blow that would hand her my entire life. My lawyer Davis sat perfectly still beside me. He did not say a single word. He did not rustle his papers or clear his throat. He simply closed his pen and laid it flat on the thick oak table. That was the signal. We had discussed this exact moment the night before in the freezing cab of my truck. I took a slow, deep breath and stared directly at the polished wooden surface in front of me. I did not move. I let the silence stretch out until it became deeply uncomfortable. The air conditioning hummed loudly above us, highlighting the incredible tension in the room. Then from the solid wooden pews directly behind me, a chair creaked. The sound was loud and sharp in the quiet room. Everyone turned their heads. My son Lucas stood up from the gallery. He was wearing a dark, charcoal suit. His posture was perfectly straight, and his shoulders were squared. He did not look like the terrified young man who had stumbled into my warehouse office 5 days ago searching for fuel logs. He looked like a man who was absolutely ready to protect his family at all costs. The judge narrowed his eyes and frowned, deeply annoyed by the sudden interruption. He asked Lucas to identify himself and explain why he was disrupting a closed family court proceeding. Lucas stepped out from the wooden pew and walked slowly down the center aisle. He stopped right at the wooden gate that separated the gallery from the legal tables. He spoke in a clear, unwavering voice that commanded instant respect. He introduced himself to the court, stating his full name and explaining that he was the biological son of both the plaintiff and the defendant. He told the judge that he respectfully requested permission to present a piece of vital evidentiary video to the court. He explained that this evidence pertained directly to the severe financial claims his mother was making and that it would definitively expose the true financial character of the plaintiff. The moment Lucas finished his sentence, Patricia dropped her crumpled tissue. Her head snapped up and her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock. The perfectly constructed mask of the helpless, terrified victim slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing the panicked predator hiding underneath. Her high-priced divorce attorney immediately sprang out of his expensive leather chair. His face turned bright red with indignation. He threw his hand out and shouted a furious, loud objection. He told the judge that this was a highly irregular and completely unacceptable breach of court protocol. He argued that a family member from the gallery had absolutely no legal standing to introduce sudden unseen evidence in the middle of a final asset allocation hearing. He demanded that Lucas be removed from the courtroom instantly and that the judge proceed with awarding the commercial heating and air conditioning business to his distressed client without any further delays. My lawyer Davis finally stood up. He spoke in a calm, measured tone that completely neutralized the aggressive shouting of the opposing counsel. Davis reminded the judge that families' court proceedings allow for a broader introduction of character evidence, especially when one party is accusing the other of severe financial abuse and cognitive decline. He pointed out that Patricia had literally just spent the last 30 minutes painting me as a dangerous, paranoid man who squandered family funds and threatened her safety. Davis argued that if the court was going to seize a massive commercial logistics fleet and leave a man completely destitute based on claims of financial instability, then the court had a profound moral and legal obligation to view all evidence pertaining to the actual financial history of the marriage. He stated that suppressing the truth now would be a monumental miscarriage of justice. The judge sat back in his heavy leather chair and steepled his fingers. He looked at the furious, red-faced attorney, and then he looked at my son, who was standing incredibly still with absolute conviction burning in his eyes. The judge had seen thousands of bitter divorces. He knew when someone was hiding a dark secret. He overruled the objection with a sharp crack of his wooden gavel. He instructed the opposing counsel to sit down and be quiet. He told Lucas that he would grant him exactly 5 minutes to present his evidence, but warned him that if this was a waste of the court time, the legal consequences for both him and the defense would be incredibly severe. Lucas did not blink or show any sign of intimidation. He thanked the judge politely and unlatched the heavy wooden gate. He walked over to our defense table and placed his thin digital tablet on the surface. He pulled a small connecting cable from his pocket. The courtroom was equipped with a large digital projector screen on the side wall, designed for presenting visual evidence in complex financial disputes. Lucas moved with the quiet, methodical efficiency of a senior corporate network architect. He plugged the cable into the court visual system and tapped a few quick commands into his tablet screen, bypassing standard display settings to ensure optimal video resolution. The large projector screen flickered to life, casting a bright white glow across the dim mahogany courtroom. I turned my head and looked at Patricia. She was gripping the edge of her table so hard her knuckles were completely white. She was staring at the blank screen with a look of mounting sheer horror. She had absolutely no idea what Lucas was about to show the court. She thought she had successfully frozen all my resources. She thought I was completely isolated and totally defenseless. She never once considered that her own son possessed the digital skills necessary to bypass her carefully laid traps and unearth her deeply buried criminal secrets. Lucas pressed a button on his screen. The bright white light on the wall shifted into a grainy, high-contrast, black and white video feed. It was the security footage from our local church administration office. The digital timestamp in the bottom right corner of the video clearly showed a date from exactly 5 years ago. The entire courtroom fell into absolute dead silence. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment, captivated by the giant screen. On the massive display, Patricia appeared. She was wearing her expensive winter coat and carrying her large, heavy designer purse. The video was unmistakably clear. We all watched as she nervously checked the empty hallway, peering over her shoulder, with quick, paranoid movements to make sure she was entirely alone in the building. We watched as she walked directly to the heavy metal lockbox in the corner of the church office. She pulled a set of unauthorized keys from her pocket, opened the secure box, and began pulling out thick canvas bank deposit bags. Those heavy bags contained the $250,000 the congregation had raised through bake sales and community donations to build a new youth outreach center. We all watched as my wife shoved bag after bag into her purse, forcing the zipper shut and practically running out of the room with the stolen community funds. The silence in the courtroom was so deep and profound, I could clearly hear the heavy ticking of the old clock on the wall. The judge leaned so far forward over his high bench he looked like he might fall out of his chair. He pulled his reading glasses off his face and stared at the screen with absolute, unadulterated shock. He had just spent 30 long minutes listening to an expensive lawyer describe Patricia as a sweet, helpless, dedicated wife who lived in pure terror of her unpredictable husband. Now he was watching her commit a massive, calculated felony on a giant digital screen in his own courtroom. Patricia let out a strange, high-pitched gasp that sounded like a dying animal. She shrank back into her wooden chair, trying to make herself as physically small as possible. Her high-priced lawyer looked like he had just been hit by a runaway train. His mouth hung open, and he stared at his client with a look of pure, terrified, professional panic. He realized in that exact second that he had built his entire career defining legal case on a foundation of absolute, verifiable perjury. He knew his own legal license was now in severe jeopardy. But Lucas was not finished tearing their world apart. He stood tall in the center of the room and looked directly at the judge. He explained that the video the court just watched was only the beginning of the truth. He told the judge that Patricia did not steal that massive sum of money because she had a secret gambling addiction, as she had tearfully claimed to me, for 5 years. He stated firmly that she stole the money to fund the fraudulent real estate business of her secret younger lover named Julian. The opposing counsel jumped up again, stammering wildly and shouting another desperate, panicked objection. He claimed this was hearsay and an illegal assassination of character completely unrelated to the divorce proceedings. The judge slammed his gavel down so hard the sound echoed like a gunshot through the room. He yelled at the lawyer to sit down immediately and threatened to hold him in contempt and have him thrown in a holding cell if he opened his mouth one more time. The judge turned back to Lucas and told him to continue playing the evidence without interruption. Lucas tapped the screen of his tablet again. He told the court that he had legally obtained audio voice notes and text transcripts from Julian unsecured corporate servers during a routine network diagnostic. He explained that these audio files would prove that the current divorce proceeding was not about an abused wife escaping a dangerous husband. It was a premeditated financial conspiracy designed to maliciously defraud the court and steal a commercial logistics fleet. A voice filled the courtroom through the overhead speakers. It was Julian. His slick, arrogant tone echoed off the heavy wooden walls. In the audio recording, he was speaking directly to Patricia. He was telling her exactly how to manipulate the church ledgers to avoid detection during the annual audit. He was laughing cruelly as he told her how easy it would be to blame the missing funds on a fake gambling problem because naive church people always pity desperate addicts. Then a second audio file played. This one was dated just 3 weeks ago. It was a voice memo Julian had sent to one of his aggressive private investors. Julian Voice bragged openly about his brilliant plan to manipulate an older, gullible woman. He explicitly stated that Patricia was currently in the process of tricking a family court judge into freezing her husband's assets using fake abuse allegations. Julian laughed loudly on the recording, boasting that as soon as Patricia secured the commercial heating and air conditioning business in the divorce settlement, he was going to take all the liquidated cash, pay off his massive corporate debts, and dump her immediately. He called her a foolish, aging cash cow and said he could not wait to cut all ties with her the very second the bank transfers cleared his accounts. The sound of Julian, cruel, mocking laughter hung in the cold, sterile air of the courtroom. The entire narrative Patricia had built, her entire aggressive legal strategy, her entire persona as a wounded victim completely disintegrated into toxic dust. The judge's face turned dark red with a righteous, furious anger. He realized that this woman and her lawyer had walked into his courtroom, signed sworn affidavits under penalty of perjury, and attempted to use his legal authority as a weapon to execute a massive criminal robbery against an innocent man. Patricia sat frozen in her wooden chair. Her face was as pale as a ghost. She was shaking uncontrollably, her chest heaving with silent, panicked breaths. She looked at the giant screen, and then she looked at her lawyer, who physically moved his chair a few inches away from her, as if her presence was suddenly contagious and toxic. She had truly believed she was a brilliant mastermind manipulator. She thought she was going to walk away with millions of dollars, my business, and a wealthy younger man. Instead, she had just been forced to sit in a quiet room and listen to the man she loved call her a gullible fool, and plot to steal everything she had just stolen for him. Lucas turned slowly away from the projector screen. He walked back to the wooden gate that separated the gallery from the legal tables. He stopped and looked directly across the room at his mother. The pain and the sorrow that had clouded his eyes for the last 5 days were completely gone. All that remained was a cold, unyielding, absolute disgust. He had spent his entire life loving and respecting this woman, and she had tried to bankrupt his small business and steal his infant daughter college fund just to protect her own selfish greed. The courtroom was completely still. Every single person in the room, including the furious judge, was watching my son. Lucas took a deep breath and spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried a heavy absolute authority that cut through the silence like a sharp knife. He looked directly into Patricia's eyes and said, "Dad kept this secret for you. He went into debt to save you from prison, and this is how you repay him." Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no words came out. She raised her trembling hands, trying to form some kind of excuse, some kind of lie, that could save her from the catastrophic reality crashing down around her. But there were no lies left to tell. The ugly, undeniable truth was burning brightly on the screen behind her. I sat quietly at the defense table, my calloused hands folded in front of me. I looked at the woman who had tried to bury me alive, and I knew the war was finally over. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. It was the kind of heavy quiet that follows a catastrophic explosion before the dust even begins to settle. Patricia stood frozen at the plaintiff table, her face drained of every ounce of color. The perfectly rehearsed tears that had wet her cheeks just moments ago were completely gone, replaced by a stark, naked terror that she could not hide. I watched her high-priced attorney move with a frantic, desperate energy. He did not say a single word to her. He did not offer any comfort or legal counsel. He simply reached across the polished wooden table and began snatching up his expensive gold pens and his perfectly printed document folders. He shoved them into his sleek leather briefcase with trembling hands. He knew that the digital evidence Lucas had just presented on that massive projector screen implicated his client in a massive, premeditated criminal conspiracy. He knew that if he continued to represent her or tried to defend the fabricated domestic disturbance report he had just argued, before the court he would be deeply, deeply complicit in federal perjury. He snapped the golden locks of his briefcase shut, turned his back on Patricia completely, and practically ran toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. He abandoned her exactly the way a rat abandons a sinking ship. The veteran family court judge sat high upon his elevated bench, staring down at the scene with a righteous, furious anger burning in his eyes. The pity and sympathy he had shown Patricia only 10 minutes earlier had evaporated entirely. He had been manipulated, lied to, and treated like a foolish pawn in a vicious scheme to steal a commercial heating and air conditioning fleet. The judge leaned forward, his dark robes shifting around his broad shoulders, and picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He slammed it down onto the sounding block with a sharp, violent crack that echoed off the cold marble walls. He did not speak in a calm, bureaucratic tone anymore. His voice was a booming, thunderous roar of absolute legal authority. He announced that he was immediately halting all proceedings related to the divorce and the division of marital assets. He declared that the emergency restraining orders and the asset freezes were completely and permanently dissolved. But he did not stop there. The judge looked directly at Patricia and informed her that he was ordering his bailiff to take immediate possession of the digital evidence my son had presented. He explicitly stated that he was forwarding the entire unredacted file directly to the district attorney office with a formal judicial recommendation for immediate felony indictments on the charges of grand larceny, criminal conspiracy, and severe perjury. Patricia heard the words federal prison and felony indictment, and her entire body began to violently shake. The reality of her situation crashed down on her with the crushing weight of a collapsed building. She realized in that exact horrifying second that her brilliant master plan had failed catastrophically. She realized that Julian, her slick younger lover, had never intended to save her or build a life with her. Julian had explicitly called her an aging, gullible cash cow on the audio recording we had just played for the entire court. Julian was planning to take my life savings and abandon her the very moment the bank transfers cleared. She had alienated her own brother. She had attempted to bankrupt her own son and freeze her infant granddaughter college fund. She had alienated her entire community and destroyed a 35-year marriage, all for a ruthless predator who despised her. She was entirely, completely alone, and she was going to jail. Her knees gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard courtroom floor, her modest pale blue blouse wrinkling as she fell. She crawled across the short distance separating our tables. She reached out with desperate shaking hands and grabbed the sleeve of my heavy canvas work jacket. She looked up at me, and the mask of the proud, arrogant woman was entirely gone. She was sobbing hysterically, her face twisted in pure agonizing panic. She begged me to help her. She pleaded with me to make the judge stop. She cried out with a broken, shattered voice, begging me to please stay. She told me she was so sorry for everything she had done. She squeezed my wrist with a frantic, desperate grip and begged me to please protect me again, just like I had protected her 5 years ago when she first stole the money from the church. I stood up from my heavy wooden chair. I looked down at the woman weeping on the floor at my feet. 5 years ago, seeing her cry had completely broken my heart. 5 years ago, I had secretly mortgaged my entire commercial business, risked the livelihoods of my 30 loyal mechanics, and sacrificed my own physical health to keep her out of a federal penitentiary. I had carried the agonizing weight of her crime in total silence, because I believed she was my partner and my family. But standing in that cold, sterile courtroom, I felt absolutely nothing for her. The sorrow and the heartbreak had been burned away by a cold, methodical clarity. I looked at her desperate, tear-streaked face, and I did not see the woman I had married 35 years ago. I spoke to her in a quiet, steady voice that carried absolutely no anger and no malice. It was just the flat, cold truth. I told her that I had protected my wife with everything I had. I told her that my wife was a good, honest woman who cared about her family and her community. I looked directly into her wide, panicked eyes, and I told her that the woman kneeling on the floor in front of me was just a stranger. I reached down and firmly but gently pulled my wrist out of her desperate grasp. I did not look back at her again. I turned to my lawyer Davis and thanked him for his calm, strategic patience. Then I turned to my son Lucas. Lucas was standing tall by the gallery gate, his jaw set in stone, his eyes clear and resolute. He had fought brilliantly to defend his father, and he had won. I placed my rough, calloused hand on his shoulder, and we walked together down the center aisle of the courtroom. We pushed open the heavy wooden double doors and walked out into the bright, long hallway, leaving Patricia weeping alone on the floor to face the absolute devastating consequences of her own terrible greed. The weeks that followed that explosive morning in courtroom number 4 moved with a swift and relentless momentum. The justice system moves incredibly fast when a furious family court judge personally hands a mountain of unassailable digital evidence over to an aggressive district attorney. Patricia was formally indicted on multiple felony counts, including grand larceny perjury and attempting to defraud the state court system. Because she had intentionally lied under oath to obtain an emergency restraining order and seize commercial assets, the prosecutor pursued the maximum possible penalties. There was no high-priced lawyer left to defend her. She had completely run out of stolen money, and her reputation was entirely destroyed. She was eventually sentenced to serve a significant term in a federal penitentiary, a bleak and lonely reality she had brought entirely upon herself. But Patricia was not the only one who faced the crushing weight of justice. Lucas had legally obtained the entire back-end archive of Julian fraudulent real estate network, and he did not just stop at exposing the divorce conspiracy. Lucas quietly bundled all the digital ledgers, the dummy corporate accounts, and the encrypted offshore transfers Julian had been using to hide money from his aggressive private investors. My son forwarded that entire comprehensive digital package directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Less than a month after the divorce hearing, federal agents executed a massive coordinated raid on Julian Slick's downtown office. They seized his luxury vehicles, froze his commercial properties, and arrested him for massive corporate tax evasion and wire fraud. Julian House of Cards collapsed spectacularly. He had spent years acting like a brilliant, untouchable predator, but he was ultimately dismantled by a brilliant network architect who simply refused to let his family be destroyed. With the bank freezes permanently lifted and the malicious restraining orders completely dissolved, I returned to my commercial heating and air conditioning warehouse. Walking through those heavy steel doors and smelling the familiar scent of machine oil and cut copper wire felt like taking a deep breath of fresh, clean air after nearly drowning. My 30 mechanics and drivers had stayed fiercely loyal to me throughout the entire ordeal. They had trusted my reputation, and I had kept my word to them. We immediately got back to work servicing the local hospitals and grocery stores that depended on us. But the business was no longer just mine. I sat down with Lucas in my dusty office and offered him a full partnership in the company. He brought his incredible digital expertise to the table, upgrading our entire commercial logistics network, streamlining our dispatch software, and completely modernizing the corporate infrastructure I had built with my bare hands. Together we merged the relentless blue-collar grit of my generation with the sharp, brilliant technology of his. The business grew stronger and more profitable than it had ever been in its 40-year history. The dark, heavy cloud that had hung over my life for 5 agonizing years was finally gone. I no longer had to wake up every morning carrying the toxic secret of Patricia crimes. I no longer had to work through blinding pain to pay off a massive corporate debt that she had created to fund her lover. I was completely free. On Sunday afternoons, Greg Patricia brother would come over to my house, and we would sit on the back porch drinking cold beers and talking about construction jobs. He had completely disowned his sister after learning the absolute truth, and he remained a staunch, loyal friend to me and Lucas. We spent our weekends together laughing, grilling steaks, and watching my infant granddaughter grow up in a home filled with genuine, honest love. I learned a profound and difficult lesson through this entire ordeal. I learned that true family is built on loyalty, respect, and absolute integrity, not just on blood or a marriage certificate. I learned that you cannot sacrifice your own peace of mind to protect someone who is actively holding a knife to your back. But most importantly, I learned that karma is a very real and very patient force. It will always eventually come for those who bite the hand that feeds them. You can build a fortress of lies, you can hire expensive lawyers, and you can try to manipulate the system to crush innocent people. But the truth is like water. It will always find a way to break through the cracks and rise to the surface. True family is built on loyalty, not blood. and karma will always come for those who bite the hand that feeds them. If you believe the truth always finds a way to the surface, hit the like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what city you are watching from and what time it is there right now.